Chapter 2883. At a glance, the surroundings of the region where the creators of perfect worlds had landed had undergone earth-shattering changes. The statues floated in all directions, staring at the special body formed by the creator of the perfect world and the heaven and earth in the center with all kinds of postures and expressions. Between them, an endless amount of strange light and shadows filled almost all the gaps in between. Those lights and shadows were of all shapes and sizes. Perhaps they were unimaginable existences that possessed unimaginable power and unimaginable characteristics. However, at this moment, everything merely turned into some sort of strange light and shadow. The only difference between them was the color and shape. At this moment, the world creators who had already left this region shuddered as an intense, lingering fear surged from the depths of their hearts. Indeed, attacking him is simply courting death. I almost ended up like him. Such thoughts kept appearing in the hearts of the world creators. As for why they thought that they almost ended up like him, it was naturally because although they had decided to leave that region and not attack the creators of perfect worlds, it was actually just a change of heart. In other words, it was because the moment they made the decision, their thoughts were inclined to leave and no longer cared about their previous enmity. They had to consider their own safety first. In fact, the difference between the hearts of the other world creators who had stayed behind and them was actually just that their thoughts were inclined in another direction at that moment. In this way, the difference between their safety and that of the world's founders who had been turned into statues was self-evident. How could they not feel lingering fear when they realized how insignificant the difference was? After the lingering fear, they walked even faster. Although they had managed to avoid this crisis, who knew what other dangers were waiting for them? Perhaps another crisis would arrive soon. They were lucky to avoid misfortune this time, but the same could not be said for the next time. At this moment, Luo Fan, who was under the suppression of the three-legged cauldron, slightly furrowed his brows. He sensed that there seemed to be some tiny impurities seeping into the suppressive force released by the three-legged cauldron. This feeling was rather mystical. The power of suppression was originally an incomparably pure existence that repelled everything. After it appeared this time, it had the support of the power related to the true Sage from the source, so its power had reached an unbelievable level. Normally speaking, any existence that triggered the suppression of this suppressive force, unless it could not be suppressed at all, would not be able to have any effect on it. He would definitely be completely suppressed and even fall into the hands of Luo Fan. However, at this moment, there was actually some sort of subtle impurity being born within this suppressive power. It was as if some sort of external power was mixing into this suppressive power and was trying to break the purity of the suppressive power. This situation made Luo Fan quite vigilant. With a thought, many changes related to this suppressive force unfolded in his mind. Very quickly, he grasped any changes that happened to the suppressive force before and after the impurities appeared. It's actually you guys. At this moment, he locked his gaze on the many heaven and earth founders from the transportation network layer that existed in the perfect realm of laws. The impurities were born just now when these heaven and earth founders triggered the suppressive force of the perfect realm of laws and were completely suppressed by this oppressive force. Before they were completely suppressed by the suppressive force, the impurities did not appear. After the suppressive force completely suppressed them, the impurities appeared. In this way, there is no need to say what caused the impurities. With a thought, Luo Fan's perception instantly penetrated the bodies and minds of the many heaven and earth founders and began to sense the situation inside and outside of them. He wanted to know what changes had happened to these heaven and earth founders during this process, as well as what kind of reaction was acting on the suppressive force. There were simply too many heaven and earth founders being suppressed. Even if a small number of heaven and earth founders had escaped due to caution and did not make a move against the perfect realm of laws, the number of heaven and earth founders that remained there was still in the hundreds of millions. These heaven and earth founders needed to be counted in the hundreds of millions, and each of them was an existence that could split heaven and earth apart. Moreover, Even the heaven and earth that they had opened up had been integrated into the perfect realm of laws in various incredible ways. In this way, the things that these heaven and earth founders represented were obviously grand and vast beyond imagination. At the very least, it was definitely not just these heaven and earth founders themselves. So that's how it is, they're heaven and earth. At this moment, Luo Fan suddenly came to a realization and became even more vigilant. Through his research and understanding of the various conditions of these heaven and earth founders, he had discovered many things that he had overlooked before. Among them, what he should have paid the most attention to was the location of the heaven and earth founders' heaven and earth. Originally, he didn't pay much attention to the heaven and earth founders' heaven and earth. After all, the perfect realm of laws that he had opened up was now far superior to all the heaven and earth in the transportation network layer. In fact, even the perfect realm of laws that simulated the state of chaos actually did not have much of an advantage over his realm of laws. Under such circumstances, he naturally didn't care too much about the final outcome of the heaven and earth that the heaven and earth founders had brought about. At most, he thought that those heaven and earth had been completely crushed and integrated into his realm of laws, just like what he had roughly sensed before. In other words, they had become bricks and tiles for this island. Moreover, according to the current situation of this realm of laws, this situation seemed to be natural. The realm of laws itself had the characteristic of being forcibly distorted into a perfect world that matched the characteristics of the realm of laws, allowing its level to step into the level of a perfect world. However, compared to a normal perfect world, this world lacked the benefits of 4 great world tribulations. In this way, it could be seen that this realm of laws was clearly in a rather empty state at this time. This kind of emptiness would naturally make one's acceptance of external power and essence much stronger. In this way, the integration of the essence and power of the heaven and earth was naturally a matter of course. This was what Luo Fan felt before. But obviously, this feeling is obviously wrong. At the very least, based on his current understanding, it was wrong. At this moment, although a large part of the essence and power had already integrated into the realm of laws, adding bricks and tiles for the completion, strengthening, and sublimation of the realm of laws, there was still a very core and extremely stubborn small part that remained intact and existed somewhere in the realm of laws. However, there was still an extremely core and stubborn small part that maintained a complete state somewhere in the world of laws. This part of the essence and power naturally still had a subtle connection with the realm of laws. They provided the creators of heaven and earth with an essence and power that surpassed that of ordinary cultivators. And the realm of laws maintained the integrity of the realm of laws through this connection, preventing the essence and power from being completely shattered, devoured, and assimilated by the realm of laws, of course. This connection was extremely subtle and obscure. If Luo Fan hadn't started from the minds and bodies of the realm of laws and comprehended this connection from the depths of their bodies and minds, he might not have discovered this connection at all. In the past, that connection had been beneficial to both the creator of the world and the world itself. It had made both of them more powerful and made them more resilient to negative effects. But at this moment, when the suppressive power affected the creators of the world, this connection was like a talisman that hastened their deaths. That kind of suppressive power could even be transmitted through a gaze. How could such a close connection not be affected? The moment the creators of the world were suppressed, the suppressive force passed through these connections to the essence and power that still retained their original characteristics, suppressing them at the same time. In other words, in that instant, it seemed like the world founders were suppressed by the suppressive power and turned into statues. However, in reality, how could the creators of heaven and earth be the only ones who were suppressed by the suppressive force? At the same time, the number of existences suppressed along with them corresponded to those who had opened up the world, but their scale was countless times greater than those who had opened up the world. Those essence and power were the essence and power of the world itself. In terms of level, such existences were actually incomparable to those who had opened up the world. After all, the creators of the world had obtained sublimation and power from the world, but their size was much smaller than that of the world. Such existences were naturally of a higher level than a portion of the world. Perhaps not much, but the difference in height was definitely there. Under such circumstances, the essence and power were still able to provide support to the creators of the world, allowing their power and essence to surpass that of ordinary cultivators. This naturally showed that the essence and power were far greater than those who had opened up the world. The result of this was that, during this process, the suppressed existences hidden in the depths of the void, hidden outside of Luo Fan's field of vision, would be many times more suppressed existences than what Luo Fan could see. This kind of unrecognized suppression was constantly having a subtle reaction against the suppressive force. This reaction was constantly accumulating towards the suppressive force and gradually affected the operation of the suppressive force. This caused the way the suppressive force operated to gradually deviate from Luo Fan's understanding. And this change, in Luo Fan's opinion, was that there were some impurities in the suppressive force. The changes that he couldn't understand and control were naturally impurities, as he realized this. The three-legged round cauldron that he was carrying shuddered slightly, and the suppressive power that had been released to completely suppress the entire island, or rather, the entire perfect world of laws, underwent a subtle adjustment in that instant. Under this adjustment, the feeling of impurities began to gradually reduce. And just when Luo Fan thought that this reduction would completely restore his expectations, that was, the feeling of purity without any impurities at the beginning, the reduction stopped after reaching a certain limit. In terms of the amount of impurities, it meant that the impurities had been reduced a lot, but in the end, there was still a portion of impurities that refused to disperse and couldn't be removed no matter what. Luo Fan couldn't be clearer about what this meant. This meant that there were still some existences that he hadn't discovered even now that were suppressed by the suppressive force. It also meant that there were existences that he still hadn't discovered and couldn't understand in his world of laws. So that's how it is. At this moment, Luo Fan's expression turned solemn. This situation seemed to be a trivial matter. After all, it was just a trace of impurities in the suppressive force. Compared to the size of the suppressive force itself, this was extremely insignificant. He could even use the suppressive force to forcibly erase these impurities. However, the meaning behind this wasn't something that could be expressed by these impurities. His control over his world of laws had unknowingly been reduced, and there were actually existences that he couldn't discover and couldn't understand. This was almost equivalent to someone unknowingly planting some kind of device in his body that he couldn't understand. Was there a need to say more about how dangerous it was? Is this what you're doing? Luo Fan raised his head and looked at the sky. His eyes seemed to penetrate endless barriers and see the incarnation of the will that existed in the depths of the sky and space-time. Chapter 2884. The voice sounded illusory, and even Luo Fan couldn't be sure if it was an illusion or if he had really heard such a voice. However, at this moment, he could only eliminate all these distracting thoughts and begin to sense the island below, as well as the supreme suppressive force released by the three-legged cauldron. The problem now was with his world of laws, and what discovered the problem was the suppressive force released by the three-legged cauldron. In this case, if he wanted to figure out what the problem was and why there was such a change, the best way was naturally to start from both directions at the same time and finally approach his target. To Luo Fan, the world of laws was almost like his own body, so he naturally had a deep understanding of it. At this moment, as he continued to sense it, the many details and mysteries of this world began to surface in his heart bit by bit. However, since he hadn't sensed the existence that he didn't know about before, he naturally couldn't reveal its true appearance in front of him so easily. Therefore, for the time being, he was experiencing the details and mysteries of this world, but he still did not find the target that he wanted to find. At most, he could only feel that this world had become more perfect, more complete, more balanced, and more harmonious than before after fusing with the characteristics of perfection after the distortion. As for the source of the impurities that caused the suppressive force, he couldn't find it at all. This was the case for the world of laws, but the situation was even more serious for the suppressive force. The source of the suppressive force was the three-legged cauldron. Although all the details of the three-legged cauldron were constructed by Luo Fan according to his own memory and understanding, and there were no secrets about its structure to him. However, its essence was the power that was related to a true divine. This essence made this power an unreachable supreme existence in front of Luo Fan. Even though he was now able to use some of the power of this power, he was still completely clueless about the deep secrets of this power. The result of this uncertainty was that whatever he knew about this power before, he already knew about it. Whatever he didn't know about before, he would never know about it again. Under such circumstances, if he tried his best to study the suppressive power and find the source of the impurities in the suppressive power, one could imagine how much he would gain. It could be said that there was almost no harvest at all. Even if he occasionally had a burst of inspiration and some subtle senses that seemed to reduce the range of impurities, it was only because of the research results of the perfect world of laws and not because of the in-depth sensing of the suppressive force. At this moment, Luo Fan had already expected such a change. However, he did not show any unusual reaction because of it. He merely worked harder to experience, comprehend, and research. After all, the impurities hadn't caused any serious consequences yet. However, if he didn't pay attention to it and allowed it to exist, it would definitely cause serious consequences in the future. Under such circumstances, even if he knew it was difficult, he still had to find the impurities. It would be best if he could completely remove them. While Luo Fan was carefully comprehending and studying, the former incarnation of the creator of the perfect world of laws and realms vaguely felt that something was amiss. For this former incarnation, Luo Fan's position in his heart had reached an extremely high level. It could be said that if there was one existence in this chaotic simulation that could convince him wholeheartedly, it would definitely be Luo Fan. However, at this moment, he suddenly faintly felt an inexplicable feeling emerging from the depths of his heart out of nowhere. It was as if the originally incomparably tall and stalwart Luo Fan seemed to have become less tall and stalwart. Has my heart changed? Have I sobered up? Or is there some external force driving my heart to distort? The former incarnation immediately felt the abnormality in his heart, and his expression couldn't help but change slightly. For him, Luo Fan's incomparably powerful and majestic point was still very clear in his heart. Everything had not changed in the slightest compared to before. However, under such circumstances, his feelings for Luo Fan had actually changed. It was as if his heart had suddenly become distorted for no reason. How could he not be vigilant in such a situation? Of course, it was also because this former incarnation was extremely concerned about his own self and was constantly on guard that he reacted so quickly. After all, to this former incarnation, his origin was just an independent incarnation of the creator of the perfect world of laws and realms. With such an origin, his own self naturally struggled out of the illusion with great difficulty. It could almost be said that he was born because of a miracle. The rarity of this was self-evident. Any existence would obviously have such a mentality. The more difficult it was to obtain something, the more they would pay attention to it. It was the same for this former incarnation. To him, the most difficult thing to obtain was obviously his own self. Is it distortion? Could this be the means of his enemy? After experiencing it, the former incarnation couldn't help but shudder. He had long known that Luo Fan had some kind of terrifying enemy. Previously, he even took the initiative to ask Luo Fan about it, but he just didn't get an answer. Under such circumstances, it was naturally easy for him to figure out the source of the change that was obviously disadvantageous to Luo Fan at this moment. As for shuddering, it was needless to say. His own self and his own mind could be distorted at will, and he couldn't even find the source of the distortion. How could an ordinary existence do such a thing? In front of him, he was probably not much stronger than an ant. Facing such a situation, how could he not shudder? He wanted to twist this distortion back so that he could revert to that feeling of respect for Luo Fan. However, in the end, he sighed and gave up on that idea. Although he had discovered this distortion, since it had already been created, his mentality had naturally changed. It was already impossible to twist it back. Just like when he gave birth to his true self, he clearly knew that the birth of his self was the result of being assimilated by Luo Fan's worldview of laws. But so what? Since his self had already been born, could it be that he could give up his own self and turn himself into an incarnation without an independent self just because the method of birth wasn't what he wanted? It was the same now. The distortion had already been created, so the self after the distortion was already his new self. Even though he knew that the birth of this self was a distortion of unknown origin, it was no longer possible for him to truly change back to his original self. After all, changing back to his original self was equivalent to completely giving up on his current self. Looks like this abnormal dispute isn't something I can participate in at all. The former incarnation smiled bitterly, turned around, and left. His goal wasn't the perfect world of laws below, but the vast world outside the world of laws, or rather, the vast world outside this island. If it were any other existence, they definitely wouldn't be able to leave this island at this time. After all, this island had already been completely suppressed by the suppressive force released by the three-legged cauldron. Although it didn't seem much different from an ordinary world, and the operation of the laws seemed to be extremely normal, the living beings and whatnot were also similar to when they weren't suppressed. However, this was just another manifestation of the suppressive effect. It didn't mean that the suppressive effect didn't exist. Since the suppressive effect existed, if he wanted to leave this island or this world, he would obviously have to break through the suppressive effect first. If he couldn't break through the suppressive effect, any existence could only stay here obediently. However, it was obvious that the former incarnation was ultimately different from other existences. No matter what, he was still an existence that had obtained a portion of the authority of this world of laws. Using the power of this world of laws had almost become his instinct. Under such circumstances, he had more opportunities to break through the suppressive force that he originally didn't have compared to other living beings and world creators. After all, the suppressive force was triggered by Luo Fan, and this world of laws was created by Luo Fan. In this way, the power of this world naturally had a certain effect on the suppressive force. Perhaps it wouldn't be very strong. At the very least, it seemed impossible to completely eliminate the suppressive force. However, it wasn't impossible to send an individual out, as long as that individual was willing to pay a sufficient price at this time. The former incarnation began to stimulate his authority over the world of laws and began to mobilize the power of the world of laws, slowly linking him up. During this process, his body gradually rose and gradually broke through the suppressive force above him. He was one step closer to the outside of the suppressive force. During this process, his body, mind, power, and everything else were constantly being melted away. They were melting into the power of the world of laws and the suppressive force. His actions were naturally seen by Luo Fan. However, Luo Fan only glanced at his actions. Although he had given this former incarnation a certain amount of authority, it didn't mean that he valued him much. In fact, the reason why he had given him the authority over the world of laws was because he didn't care about the world of laws previously. Now that this former incarnation was willing to abandon everything he had obtained from the world of laws, including the world of laws, he was naturally happy to see it happen. At this time, the former incarnation's figure continued to rise and gradually approach the edge of the suppressive force. It was also the edge of the boundless sea formed by the power of the tribulations outside. At this point, his entire body had completely melted away, leaving behind only a subtle sense of self that remained within the power and might of the heaven and earth, slowly moving upwards amidst the suppressive force. Apart from this illusory self, everything else had completely melted away and returned to the world of laws, completely devoured by the suppressive force at this moment. The waves that towered between heaven and earth suddenly rolled up slightly, and a subtle whirlpool suddenly appeared out of thin air, seemingly welcoming the former incarnation self into it. Immediately afterward, the remaining self of the former incarnation trembled slightly and pounced forward, directly penetrating the obstruction of the suppressive force and rushing into the whirlpool. "You actually didn't stop me." At this moment, a voice suddenly came from the whirlpool. This voice was illusory, somewhat similar to the voice he couldn't determine if he was hallucinating before, but it was more substantial. It was precisely because of this that Luo Fan was completely certain of the authenticity of this voice. At this moment, an inexplicable expression appeared on Luo Fan's face as he said, "As expected, you've become the world will of this world." "You let him out just to make sure of that? Are you sure that I'll definitely appear at this time?" the voice asked. At this moment, the whirlpool distorted slightly and turned into the shape of a huge eye. In essence, it was still a whirlpool, but it looked like a huge eye. "Of course I can't be sure, but I just want to know why you want him to leave and what benefits will his departure bring to you," Luo Fan said indifferently. At this moment, his expression was incomparably calm, and no one could tell that he was carefully studying the hidden dangers in his world that he couldn't control. Hearing this, the whirlpool seemed to laugh and said, "Maybe there will be benefits. Maybe there won't be any benefits. Who knows?" As they spoke, the whirlpool began to gradually dissipate, and the voice also disappeared completely as if it had never appeared before. Seeing the whirlpool disappear and the voice fade, Luo Fan's expression became slightly solemn. It seems that it's quite difficult to deal with him. After a long time, he sighed slightly. Chapter 2885. Although he had regained his composure, it didn't mean that Luo Fan knew how to deal with the incarnation of the will of this world. Instead, it was because he knew that only by regaining his composure could he find a way to deal with it. Therefore, he regained his composure. The departure of his former incarnation wasn't much of a loss to him. After all, his former incarnation was an outsider to the world of laws. Even if he obtained the authority of the world of laws bestowed by Luo Fan and became the second person with the authority of the world of laws, it was something that Luo Fan could take back with a single thought. Under such circumstances, the departure of his former incarnation was no different from an outsider leaving his world of laws. How could it be considered a loss? As for the authority of the world of laws that the previous incarnation possessed, it had already been sacrificed in the process of drawing upon the might and power of the world of laws. It had been completely stripped away by the suppressive force. Naturally, it wasn't swept away in the slightest. In this case, what did the departure of his former incarnation matter to Luo Fan? However, this didn't mean that it was meaningless for the incarnation of the will to obtain his former incarnation. After all, no matter what, his former incarnation had stayed in his world of laws and had once grasped the authority of the world of laws. This also meant that there were many things about him that could be used. At the very least, there were many things that could be used compared to the incarnation of the will. As for what it could be used for, how it could be used against his world of laws, and how it could be used against him, it would depend on how the incarnation of the will would consider and deal with it. From a certain point of view, sending it away could be said to be sending a convenient passage that could be used against him to the hands of his opponent. If this was considered a loss, then letting his former incarnation leave would actually be a considerable loss for Luo Fan. However, Luo Fan didn't feel that it was a great loss. After all, for the incarnation of the will, he didn't dare to say that he was full of flaws and weaknesses, but he could still easily find some points to target. Under such circumstances, the passageway that the former incarnation represented wasn't that precious. Even if there weren't any, the will incarnation could easily find a lot of them. If Lin Yin thought about it from this aspect, he could send his former incarnation out and let it deal with him according to the path that the former incarnation had pointed out. This would allow him to have a rough idea of the direction that the incarnation would target and save him a lot of energy to be on guard. Of course, even if he could save some energy to defend himself, it would still be limited. At this moment, It was not worth it for Luo Fan and the Will Incarnation to take him seriously. At this moment, Luo Fan suddenly trembled slightly. He suddenly sensed that there seemed to be some subtle changes occurring in the vast world outside this island. This sort of subtle change covered the entire heavens and the earth, and its tentacles had even penetrated deep into the core of this world. It was even to the extent that it affected the grand Tao of this world. Is it going to devour all of the heavens and earth? At this moment, such a thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind, and his expression became increasingly solemn. This kind of change that covered the entire world was fundamentally making this world richer and fuller, making the indescribable mysteries that existed in it more and more numerous. How similar was all of this to the changes that occurred on this island previously? How did the changes on this island come about? At this moment, it was very likely that the changes on this side of the world were due to the same reason. In other words, the essence and power of countless worlds were also integrated into this world. Moreover, judging from the changes that occurred in his world of laws before, in order to trigger such a great change, the amount of essence and power that had been integrated into this world would definitely be countless times more than the amount of worlds that had been integrated into his world of laws before. The amount of essence and power that had been integrated into his world of laws before was already in the hundreds of millions. Right now, the amount of power and essence of the world that had fused with this great world was countless times more than this. As such, it was easy to imagine how many worlds had fused with this world. It could be said that this was definitely a scale that could expand his perspective from a single layer of chaos to the entire simulated state of chaos. It was precisely because of this that he made such a judgment at this moment. At this moment, the only existence that Luo Fan had left in the simulated state of chaos that was related to him was the broken transportation network layer. As the transportation network layer passed the tribulation and became broken, his control over the transportation network layer had unknowingly weakened to a certain limit. Under that limit, he could no longer use the transportation network layer to sense the various things in the simulated state of chaos. Therefore, at this moment, he had completely lost the ability to sense the current situation in the simulated state of chaos from the transportation network layer. In other words, at this time, if he wanted to know the situation in the simulated state of chaos, he could only rely on his own memory and the situation of this world. Therefore, although he had such a guess at this time, he still wasn't completely sure what was going on. Whether it was really as he thought, that most of the worlds in the simulated state of chaos had been devoured and brought into this world. It seems that he was experimenting on me before. At this moment, Luo Fan suddenly had an inexplicable realization. Previously, the incarnation of the will had created various situations to allow his world of laws to fuse with the essence and power of the many worlds in the transportation network layer. However, one of the purposes of using this place as an experiment was to see what would happen after fusing with the essence and power of those worlds before fusing with the many worlds in the state of chaos. This was obviously one of the purposes. In fact, this might even be the main purpose. As for the others, such as causing impurities to form in Luo Fan's suppression power and causing some existences that he couldn't control to appear in his world of laws, these were obviously just secondary purposes. An inexplicable displeasure instantly surged in his heart. However, this inexplicable displeasure soon disappeared without a trace, and it turned into a subtle joy. However, this kind of situation was also a breakthrough for him. A breakthrough to discover what the things in this world that were not under his control were, and the source of the impurities that caused his suppression power to produce. This seemed unbelievable, but in fact, the emergence of such a breakthrough was almost inevitable. After all, if the incarnation of the will really used Luo Fan's island or this perfect world of laws as a test subject and tried to see what would happen after integrating the essence and power of the external world, then the situation that was happening in this great world of laws could also be regarded as a reflection of the changes that happened in the world of laws before. In other words, if one were to look at it from another perspective, everything that was happening in this great world could also be seen as the results of the experiments that had taken place in the past. After all, if it was really as Luo Fan thought, then what had happened in the past and what was happening in this world now were the same kind of change. In this case, they could naturally reflect each other and act as a mirror. Everything that happened in the world of laws was the experimental process of the great world. However, on the other hand, if time was ignored, then what was happening in this great world could also be regarded as the experimental process of the changes that had happened in the world of laws. It was just that from the latter perspective, the experiment happened later, and the changes of the main body appeared first, which seemed more unreasonable. However, no matter how unreasonable it was just unreasonable, and the essence wouldn't change much. It was precisely because of this that Luo Fan felt such joy at this time. It was more difficult to know oneself than to see through others. It was the same here. If one wanted to completely understand one's own world and grasp all the details and changes in one's own world, it was obviously more difficult than understanding all the details and changes in other worlds. Therefore, even if the world that was reflected outside was only a world on the same scale as the world of laws, with its reflection, it was enough for Luo Fan to study the changes that might occur in his own world of laws that were beyond his understanding and control. Not to mention, at this moment, the world that was undergoing the same changes as the world of laws was billions of times greater and more vast than the world of laws. Under such circumstances, what might have been an extremely insignificant change to the world of laws would become extremely obvious to this world. At the very least, it would become extremely obvious to him. Under such circumstances, for Luo Fan, who wanted to understand the details contained in the changes, it was self-evident how great the benefits of having this world as a reflection were. At this moment, Luo Fan's heart shook slightly, and the world of laws surged slightly. A subtle impact rushed towards the power related to the true sage in the depths of the world of laws. Boom, boom, boom. For a time, the entire world of laws began to shake wildly, as if some incredible power was shaking the entire world, causing the foundation of the entire world to be shaken. In the blink of an eye, more than half of this world had been completely destroyed. From its original normal appearance, it had turned into a dusky, almost primal state. This was because the impact produced by the vibration had completely destroyed that part of the world, causing more than half of the world to completely collapse. The source of all this was obviously the result of the shock wave caused by the collision between the infinite power of the world of laws and the power related to the true sage that Luo Fan had triggered just now. Compared to the power related to the true sage, the shock wave was relatively insignificant. However, it was such a small shock wave that caused more than half of the world of laws to be destroyed when it acted on the world of laws. It went without saying how incredible the power related to the true sage was. However, such an impact was not without results. At this moment, as more than half of the entire world was destroyed and turned into a chaotic state of chaos, wisps of power that were related to the true sage also surged out. These strands of power looked extremely mysterious and boundless. There was even the charm of a true sage within them, making it impossible for anyone to comprehend it. Just these traces of power were enough to make all cultivators who were not true sages feel despair. In the end, it's still better to extract it directly. At this moment, Luo Fan sighed in his heart. These traces of power seemed to be the same as the power related to the true sage, but in fact, it was not the power related to the true sage. Compared to the trace of power that he had separated from the power that he had obtained by integrating his own perception into it, the power that was now the carrier of his incarnation was fundamentally different. The power that was now being used as the carrier of his incarnation was fundamentally the same as the power related to the true sage that his original body had entrusted to it. Although there was a difference of billions of times in terms of size, now, the traces of power that were produced because of the surging impact were completely different. Although, at first glance, it seemed to be the same as the power related to the true sage, in essence, It was just because of the endless power that surged with the power related to the true sage. In the end, it was assimilated by the power, and its essence was enhanced. It was just like the previous incarnation of the creator of the perfect world that was born after being distorted by the world of laws. Although this power possessed the mysteries of the power related to the true sage, it was fundamentally incomparable to the power related to the true sage. Chapter 2886. After the strands of power took shape, Luo Fan locked onto them immediately. His powerful mind will gushed into the strands of power crazily as he tried his best to imprint his own mark on the power. This process was rather bumpy. Compared to the real power related to a true divine, the level of the power was naturally much lower. It was not to the extent that it was impossible for those below the true divine level to truly understand it. However, its level was far beyond the understanding of ordinary cultivators below the true divine level. Under such circumstances, the level of the power was obviously much higher than the current Luo Fan. In this case, what Luo Fan was doing was obviously equivalent to an ant imprinting his own mark on a planet. In the eyes of everyone, even the planet itself, this planet would belong to this ant. It went without saying how difficult it would be. It could be said that if it wasn't for Luo Fan's mental fortitude that had reached an unimaginable height, and that this power wasn't really related to a true divine, this matter wouldn't have been as simple as it seemed. It would have been absolutely impossible. At this moment, Luo Fan's mind will continue to pour into the power, trying his best to assimilate the power so that a mark that belonged to him would appear in the power. However, almost all of his mind will's efforts were in vain. He did not even have the ability to really come into contact with the power, let alone leave a mark that belonged to him in it. Only a very small number of mind wills, either because of the timing or because the power happened to be in a special transformation stage, could enter the power and really come into contact with it. Although he could only come into contact with it and was still far from leaving his own mark in it, he could still come into contact with it. However, he could still come into contact with it, and it was considered a good start. Such mind wills occupied a relatively small proportion of the total mind will that Luo Fan intended to pour into the power. It could be said that there were only 1 or 2 mind wills in a million mind wills. However, this was enough for Luo Fan. After all, to him, as long as he could continue, the final outcome was almost certain. The only difference was the level of efficiency. There were only 1 or 2 mind wills in a million mind wills that could come into contact with that power. In that case, he would use billions of trillions of mind wills to try. In this way, even if there were only 1 or 2 mind wills in a million mind wills, he would still be able to achieve his goal in the end. Luo Fan's efficiency was self-evident. The injection of mind wills almost completely ignored the changes in time. Unknowingly, the amount of Luo Fan's spirit will in that power had already reached a level where it was enough to leave a mark that belonged to him in that power. This situation was like an ant wanting to terraform a planet and leave a mark that belonged to it. Anyone who saw the planet would know that it was modified by it and that it belonged to it. This was obviously an almost impossible task. However, if the number of ants increased to billions of trillions, trillions of trillions, then it was only natural that traces of ants would be left on this planet. Even if an ant wanted to leave a mark, it would be impossible. This was the situation at this time. Luo Fan's mind wills were equivalent to an ant. At this time, the countless mind wills that were piled up in it were equivalent to an infinite number of ants. It was naturally an almost impossible task for an ant to change that power and create a mark that belonged to him in that power. When a number of ants increased to a certain extent, it would be impossible for him not to leave a mark even if he wanted to. In the end, under the impact of the endless mind wills, that power gradually distorted and gradually transformed into a humanoid form, a figure that looked almost identical to Luo Fan. I've finally succeeded. At this moment, the figure revealed a relaxed expression and let out a sigh. This voice was exactly the same as Luo Fan's voice. Obviously, this power had been completely refined by Luo Fan and became the basis of his incarnation. It was just like the wisp of power related to true divine previously Such an incarnation was much worse than the incarnation formed by the power related to true divine. If Luo Fan himself did not have the authority to control the power related to true divine, he would not be able to separate a trace of power to act as his own incarnation. Even if it was just a tiny trace, he would naturally want to use the real power related to true divine to act as his own incarnation. However, even if it was not comparable to the power related to true divine, the essence of this power was much stronger than that of ordinary existences below true divine. In this way, the power of the incarnation that was born was not something that ordinary existences could resist. At the very least, it was enough for Luo Fan to form this incarnation. At this moment, the incarnation swept across the world of laws that had been mostly destroyed. With a slight thought, an inexplicable wave was released from his body and covered the entire world of laws in the blink of an eye. As the wave spread, the entire world of laws began to distort indescribably. Time seemed to flow backwards in an instant, and all the damage caused by the impact began to recover rapidly. In a blink of an eye, most of the broken world had already become as good as new. It was as if the destruction from before had never appeared. Even the living beings that had been destroyed had been completely resurrected and were still living in the world of laws like before. It was the same for the world founders. That's right, the creators of the world weren't completely unaffected by the destruction of most of the half-world. Although not all the world founders were destroyed, the number of world founders that were destroyed was still in the hundreds of millions. Now that the world had completely recovered under the will of Luo Fan's avatar, the creators of the world had also completely recovered at the same time. Moreover, not a single one of them knew that they had died just now. What this situation represented couldn't be any more obvious. This meant that the creators of the world had truly integrated into the world of laws. Now, rather than saying that they were world founders, it would be more accurate to say that they were world founders within the world of laws. Complete integration. Luo Fan looked at this scene with all sorts of inexplicable guesses in his heart. In his heart, he didn't want these world founders to completely integrate into his world of laws. After all, each of these world founders had their own unique worldview, and each of them had unique characteristics that were different from the world of laws. Integrating them into the world of laws didn't bring many benefits to the world of laws. Instead, it would cause the world of laws to be out of his control, or in other words, existences that conflicted with his worldview. Such a situation was obviously not what he wanted to see. However, it was a pity that the process of these world founders integrating into the world of laws wasn't under his control. Even if he wanted to stop it, he couldn't think of a way to stop it. By the time he came back to his senses, the numerous world founders had already completely integrated into the world of laws. Even if he wanted to abandon and expel them, he was no longer confident that he could truly achieve his goal perfectly. Not to mention anything else at this time, the existence of the world founders that had integrated into the world of laws, causing the suppression force to produce impurities, was clearly not under his control. In fact, he couldn't even find it. Under such circumstances, how could he possibly expel it? If he completely ignored the impurities that he couldn't control, then what was the point of expelling the world founders? The hidden dangers left behind by the world founders still remained in the world of laws. On the contrary, the benefits that the world founders could bring to him had been expelled. Such an approach was obviously meaningless. Although he didn't care about the benefits brought to him by the integration of these world founders, he wasn't so unreasonable that he would rather expel these benefits for the sake of mental cleanliness. With such thoughts flashing through his mind, he shifted his attention away from the world founders. He turned his head and looked at the force that was related to the true sage behind him. That force didn't seem to be any different from before, and it seemed as if nothing had changed. The entire force was so calm that it made people wonder if it could continue to be calm until the end of time. Looking at the calm appearance of this force, Luo Fan couldn't help but sigh. The shock wave that was produced before was enough to completely destroy most of the world of laws. To this force, perhaps it was just like the fur on a living creature that was slightly shaken. Sighing to himself, he turned around and left. In the blink of an eye, his figure had already crashed into the suppression force and arrived at the edge of the suppression force. This suppression force was absolute to other existences, and even the sight of it would affect them. However, for Luo Fan, who was the one who cast this suppression force, it was just a force that he could control at will. In this way, he could naturally move about freely within this suppressive force, and he could even reach any location within this suppressive force at will. After arriving here, the new incarnation didn't stop at all. He directly stepped out of the suppression force and stepped into the boundless world outside. Boom, 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 boom. For a time, the world was stirred and the waves were rolling. Towering waves were produced continuously, pressing towards him. He had only appeared outside the suppressive power, but he had already triggered an intense reaction from the boundless world outside. In the face of this monstrous wave, Luo Fan just smiled faintly. With a wave of his hand, a suppressive force instantly pressed down on the wave, causing the monstrous wave to completely lose its momentum and directly stagnate in the void. It looked like a lifelike sculpture. Around the wave, the seawater tumbled, and a terrifying force was constantly generated. It rushed towards this area, trying to push the stagnant, monstrous wave forward. However, the moment the waves entered a certain range, they instantly froze and turned into the same statues. This situation caused layers of patterns to appear on the back of the wave. It seemed more and more chaotic and also more and more dangerous. The terrifying commotion continued to spread outwards, constantly expanding towards the already turbulent seawater in the surroundings. It was as if there was an unimaginable existence behind the endless seawater, using all kinds of unimaginable methods to push the seawater. The range of the wave continued to expand, and the height of the wave behind the monstrous wave continued to rise. Although it was still inferior to the monstrous wave, its main goal was still to push the monstrous wave to crush Luo Fan. However, this was only temporary. The wave was obstructed in this area, and its power continued to accumulate. The wave behind it was bound to get taller and taller. When the height of the wave surpassed the monstrous wave in front of him that had already been frozen, the wave would turn the tables and completely overwhelm the monstrous wave in front of it, crushing Luo Fan and the monstrous wave together. In the face of such a situation, the wisest thing for Luo Fan to do was to leave quickly and keep changing his position. He wouldn't stay in any position on the sea for too long. However, this wasn't what he was doing at this moment. He just stood there quietly, waiting for the monstrous wave in front of him to continue to evolve. Let me see how far you can go, he thought to himself as he carefully observed the various changes inside and outside the monstrous wave. Moving around in this world at all times was clearly not something he was willing to do. It wasn't that he couldn't do it, but rather that he wanted to do it and being forced to do it were two completely different concepts. If he wanted to do it, it was his interest. But if he was forced to do it, it was his incompetence. Chapter 2887. Therefore, what Luo Fan needed to do now was to find a way to gain a foothold in this world. It wasn't too difficult for him to move around in this world and not stay in the same place for too long. However, he needed another choice. He needed to have the ability to gain a foothold in this world. This was a matter of choice and also a matter of ability. At this moment, an even larger and more terrifying wave, which was enough to completely crush the sea wave and the place where Luo Fan was located, came crashing down towards Luo Fan like the sky had collapsed. Ga. After the wave approached Luo Fan for a certain distance, it suddenly froze. It was also suppressed by the suppressive force. The suppressive effect was so strong that even though there was still an endless amount of seawater behind him, the endless impact was constantly pushing towards the center. It wanted to push the huge wave forward and let it release a more terrifying destructive power. It wanted to completely destroy Luo Fan's incarnation in the center. It couldn't let the suppressed wave shake even a little. It was as if this sort of suppression and stagnation had already become the fundamental laws of this world, and it was something that no power or method could resist, Faced with this situation, a faint smile appeared on Luo Fan's face. This situation obviously meant that even if he didn't move in this world, the wave wouldn't be able to break through the obstruction of the suppressive force and wouldn't really affect him. At this moment, the waves behind him were still constantly pushing towards the center. The seawater was endless. If the front was blocked, the seawater behind would push further, brewing an even bigger wave towards the center. In this way, no matter how high the wave in front was, the wave that appeared behind him would be even higher than the original wave that came towards Luo Fan. In the end, after a while, an even more terrifying wave came crashing over. This time, the wave had exceeded the height of the suppressive force. It directly crushed down from the sky like the Milky Way was shattering. This terrifying scene made people feel as if the entire sky was collapsing. But even so, the wave was instantly suppressed when it reached a certain height. It was completely stagnant in the void, and it looked just like any other wave. After this happened a few times, the place where Luo Fan was looked like a huge sphere from the outside. The sphere was a hollow sphere of seawater. It looked perfectly round from the outside, but one could see the shape of the front end inside. Endless waves constantly rushed towards this sphere, but the final result was like seawater crashing against a diamond. They just kept passing by the sphere, but in the end, they didn't leave any trace on the sphere. This process lasted for several days. In these days, the sea waves were monstrous. The endless waves turned into waves from all directions and constantly rushed towards the place where Luo Fan was located. They smashed fiercely on the surface and quickly slid away. Then another wave rushed over and slid away again, and so on and so forth. The cycle repeated without end. Until today, after several days of impact, the sphere didn't shake at all and didn't have the slightest change in shape. It looked the same as it did at the beginning, as if time hadn't passed at all. Perhaps it already knew that this method could no longer have any effect on the suppressive force. So the existence that controlled the waves, which was also the incarnation of the will, finally couldn't be bothered to continue. The waves no longer increased in size. Instead, they were like an ordinary island. Although there were waves constantly crashing towards it, the intensity had become ordinary. Evidently, at this time, the waves had already regarded Luo Fan's incarnation as an existence similar to the island beside it. Sensing that the waves outside had calmed down, Luo Fan revealed a faint smile. "It seems that I've succeeded." With a thought, he lifted his foot and took a step forward. With the suppressive force that he had drawn from the other incarnation, he left the sphere of waves and appeared on a relatively calm sea in the distance. As he left, the sphere suddenly trembled and an endless impact crushed towards the center. In the end, it let out an earth-shattering roar. Amidst the roar, all the waves were completely shattered and turned into endless seawater that poured towards the center, setting off a huge commotion. At this moment, the waves surged again where Luo Fan was and began to rush towards him again. However, compared to before, the waves didn't seem to be as active as before. It felt more like they were just doing it for show. It was easily suppressed by Luo Fan, who had completely suppressed it. Moreover, compared to before, the suppression this time was not the kind that froze the waves in the void. Instead, it was the kind that directly suppressed the waves. In other words, after the suppressive force passed, the waves were completely flattened, and the surroundings of this area had completely turned into a calm sea. If it was before, the surrounding seawater would definitely be turbulent again, and endless waves would continuously surge from all directions in an attempt to annihilate Luo Fan's incarnation. But this time, after the confrontation that lasted for a few days, the Will incarnation had clearly given up on the idea of using waves to deal with Lin Yun's incarnation. As a result, after being suppressed, the waves directly gave up on continuing. They only surged slightly outside, directly causing the surface of the sea within a radius of several 100,000 feet to become as smooth as a mirror, directly reflecting the clouds in the sky. After looking around, Luo Fan chose a target for himself. The target was none other than the one that was closest to him. It was a certain underwater palace that was formed when the will incarnation absorbed the many worlds that simulated the state of chaos. The will incarnation absorbed the essence and power of the world that simulated the state of chaos, and in the end, it took on all sorts of strange forms in this world. Some looked like islands, some looked like heavenly palaces above the clouds, some looked like underwater palaces, and some looked like some kind of airflow underground, some kind of oars, and even some kind of changing patterns. It could be said that if Luo Fan couldn't think of it, there was nothing that didn't exist. If this world was said to be a little monotonous before, as if there was only a huge ocean and there was nothing to write home about in many other aspects, then this world had now become many times more plentiful. It could be said that there were simply too many things that could be discussed in this world. In fact, any location and any phenomenon could be found, and any aspect that could be discussed could be found. At this moment, the underwater palace that Luo Fan wanted to explore was one of these changes. It was also one of the changes that occurred after the essence and power of certain world was absorbed. The seawater below was extremely repulsive to him. If he came into direct contact with the seawater would not be stingy in pouring its endless power on him. However, this obviously could not stop Luo Fan's action. As a cultivator, why would he need to swim and dive in the sea with difficulty like mortals? With a spell, he would naturally be able to avoid the water completely. This was only for ordinary cultivators. For Luo Fan, this method was even more mysterious. At this time, he only needed to slightly guide the suppression power from the other incarnation to create a space for himself that was completely isolated from the seawater. This allowed him to dive to any depth in the seawater at will, and he could also go to any position he wanted through the bottom of the sea. At this moment, his body did not come into contact with any seawater at all, and he directly arrived outside the underwater palace in the depths of the sea. Although this underwater palace was called a palace, it was actually a huge city, a city that normally wouldn't appear in any world, a city that was like a world. The entire city was so vast that one would need to calculate its length and width in light years. However, the city was not as lifeless as the outside world. In other words, it was not as lifeless as the outside world. It was like a normal world in which there were countless living beings. There were even various cultivators living, cultivating, and growing in it. For these living beings, they did not know that they were at the bottom of the sea, nor did they know that they were just in a city. In their senses, they were in a world, a vast and boundless world. The walls of this city were extremely tall. Behind the walls was an almost boundless wasteland, or rather, an empty space. After a long enough distance from the wasteland, it was the place where intelligent living beings lived. All sorts of buildings began to gradually appear, and all sorts of living beings began to appear. Perhaps the living beings in the city did not find it strange, but Luo Fan only needed to take a look to know that this city was different from other worlds. There were all sorts of living beings born in this city, and there was no humanoid living being among them. This was needless to say. After all, this city was originally a world that was completely different from the laws of the world, so the beings with born Taoism aptitude naturally could not look like humans. However, what was really strange was the various natural landscapes that were derived from it, such as mountains, lakes, forests, grasslands, swamps, and all sorts of vegetation. Everything had traces of being specially designed. For example, there were naturally many buildings on the mountains that were suitable for intelligent living beings to live in. There would also naturally be some buildings like tree houses in the forests, and there would naturally be corresponding buildings in the grasslands, swamps, and vegetation. It did not look like a naturally formed world at all. At this moment, Luo Fan directly stepped into the city, and with a glance, he already understood everything about the city. This city was originally a world of its own. The creator of this world had also been pulled over by this world, and he was now also in this city. However, the situation of his existence was not in the form of a cultivator like before. Instead, He had turned into some sort of law of this city and was implemented in all aspects of the city. He had completely integrated with this city. At this moment, no matter how hard Luo Fan tried to sense, he could not feel the mental fluctuations that belonged to the creator of this world. Obviously, the original creator of this world had already lost his consciousness. This city had completely integrated with this world, and it had an extremely close connection with all the laws of this world, and even the great Tao within it. Although it had only appeared in this world not long ago, and the entire process was witnessed by Luo Fan, it naturally gave off a feeling that it was inseparable from this world. However, it naturally gave off a feeling that it was inseparable from this world. It was as if it had existed since the birth of this world, and would continue to exist in the endless distant future. Faced with this situation, Luo Fan frowned slightly. This situation was a little difficult for him to understand. Why did the incarnation of the will deliberately create this situation? Could it be to make up for the lack of this world, or could it greatly strengthen its power? All sorts of inexplicable thoughts flashed through his mind, and in the end, he shook his head and thought to himself, then let's see what will happen if I destroy it. When he said to destroy it, he naturally didn't mean completely destroying the city. Instead, he wanted to destroy the plan of the incarnation of the will and completely change the situation that the incarnation of the will had deliberately created. Among them, the most effective target was obviously already in front of him. It was none other than the creator of the world of the original world of the city, who had now turned into a certain vital rule of this city. Chapter 2888. With a slight thought, Luo Fan had already arrived at the top of a certain mountain in this underwater city. Like the other mountains in this city, this mountain peak had many man-made buildings that were obviously traces of civilization. At the peak of this mountain peak, there was a gazebo. The size of this gazebo was just right for Luo Fan's body size, making Luo Fan look rather harmonious in it. This was also the result of his special choice. There were actually quite a lot of mountains with gazebos on them. However, not all of them were suitable for living beings that were the size of Luo Fan. Some gazebos were suitable for living beings that were smaller than Luo Fan or even the size of an ant. Some were suitable for living beings that were hundreds of meters or even thousands of meters tall. Evidently, Luo Fan was not interested in staying in a gazebo that was not suitable for his body size. Therefore, he chose this gazebo to stay on a mountain peak that happened to be his size. Standing in the pavilion, Luo Fan could not help but sigh in his heart at the wonder of this city as he sensed the pavilion that was formed naturally. After randomly choosing a seat in this gazebo and sitting down, he closed his eyes and carefully sensed the law that was clearly formed by the creator of this world. That law was constantly circulating in the city, and it was closely related to everything in the city. It seemed to decide and control everything behind the scenes, but did not have any consciousness and did not show any signs of intelligence. At this moment, the moment Luo Fan's senses came into contact with this law, he felt an indescribable emptiness in his heart. This emptiness was clearly the feeling that the law gave him on the spiritual level. This kind of emptiness meant that what he had sensed earlier was completely correct. The laws indeed didn't have any sentience. As an existence transformed by the creator of this world, it actually became ignorant and had no intelligence, and could only operate according to a fixed and mechanical program. This was clearly an extremely sad thing. That was because Luo Fan had no friendship with the creator of this world. At this moment, he could not help but sigh. There must be a remnant. Let me see where your core remnant is. With a thought, Luo Fan sorted out his emotions and thought to himself. With that thought in mind, his consciousness surged, and he no longer had any scruples as he surged toward that wave of rules. In an instant, the entire city trembled slightly. All the living beings in the city sensed some sort of subtle change in their surroundings, as if an unbelievable existence had suddenly descended upon the city. This city was at the bottom of the sea. Endless seawater filled every part of this city, making it look like a crystal palace at the bottom of the sea. At this moment, as the city shook, the endless seawater that filled the city also began to shake violently. The shaking of the seawater was completely different from the shaking of the city from before. This kind of tremor was 10 times stronger than the tremor of the city, 10 times more obvious. In fact, the destruction it caused was more than 10 times stronger. In just an instant, countless things in the city were instantly crushed by the impact of the seawater, and many fragments flew in all directions. This kind of change should have caused the deaths of many living beings. However, at this moment, the law that was formed by the creator of this world moved. All sorts of subtle changes appeared in the law, and an indescribable and strange power was instantly produced. It acted on the many living beings in various ways, such as guiding, redirecting, or resisting. In the end, even many of the buildings in the city were destroyed, but in the end, not a single living being died. This was simply a miracle. At this moment, Luo Fan felt a strange repulsive force acting on his body. This was the rejection of this city towards him. Or, to be more specific, it was the rejection of him by the creator of the world, who had already turned into the unconscious rules of the world. Evidently, his actions of not caring about the lives of the living beings in this city had touched the bottom line of the law. At the same time, as the seawater surged in the sky above Luo Fan's head, a pitch-black liquid vaguely appeared. It was just like the tribulation clouds that appeared in the sky of a normal world. Faintly, there was a faint electric light flickering within the pitch-black liquid. At this moment, Luo Fan's consciousness sensed an indescribable fury from the law, a fury that was completely targeted at him. Sensing these changes, Luo Fan was not alarmed. Instead, he was overjoyed. Although this situation was targeted at him, it also broke the silence of the law. Although this was not as good as directly activating the remnant will of the creator of this world and the law, it was already a step closer than before. At this moment, he did not care about the rejection of this city, nor did he care about the pitch-black liquid that was brewing an attack. He only focused on injecting more spirit will into the law, stirring it according to the law, and making contact with the fury that surged from the depths of the law. This emotion was not the true will of the creator of this world, but it originated from that will, even if it was just a remnant of the will. Under such circumstances, this fury was clearly the best breakthrough point to make contact with the will of the creator of this world. At this moment, the fury became even more intense. When his spirit will was infused, the tremors in the city and the waves in the sea became more and more intense. The pitch-black liquid that had just appeared in the sky finally brewed some power to a certain limit. In an instant, endless lightning bolts rushed out of the pitch-black liquid and crushed towards Luo Fan in an overwhelming manner. The lightning net was extremely dazzling, and each bolt of lightning was the size of a pillar. They were as bright and dazzling as the sun and moon. When they appeared here, they directly illuminated the originally dark bottom of the sea. This lightning was clearly not ordinary. If ordinary lightning came into contact with the seawater, it would definitely spread endlessly and eventually disappear. However, this lightning bolt showed no signs of dissipating. As it pressed down, the lightning became unimaginably condensed. Although the surrounding seawater was constantly surging, it could not stir up the lightning at all, nor could it draw out the slightest bit of it. The lightning was even more concentrated here than it was in the air. It was exactly the same as it was when it left the black liquid and finally pressed down on Luo Fan's head. Crack, crack, boom. Under the cover of the lightning net, countless cracks instantly appeared on the mountain peak. The entire mountain peak seemed to have instantly turned from a complete and flawless appearance into the appearance of countless small stones piled together. Although it hadn't collapsed yet, it was clear that there was some kind of external force suppressing these rocks. Obviously, the external force that was suppressing these stones and preventing them from collapsing and shattering was, of course, Luo Fan. At this moment, Luo Fan's figure did not change at all. The lightning seemed to directly cover his entire body, as if endless power was directly released to his entire body. However, in the end, it did not leave a trace on his body at all. It gave people the feeling that these lightning bolts were just illusions, or that his body was just an illusion. Faced with such a situation, Luo Fan's expression did not change at all. Looking at him, it was as if nothing had happened before. The pitch-black liquid in the sky obviously did not stop there. More lightning was continuously released from it, covering the sky and covering the earth as it pounced on this mountain peak. Boom, 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 boom. Endless sounds and fluctuations kept erupting from this location. Light constantly shone, making this place seem like a sun in this underwater city. The dazzling light directly illuminated the void within a radius of hundreds of thousands of miles, making this area seem like it was exposed to the scorching sun. As time passed, the number of lightning bolts that were blasted out increased. The momentum seemed to become more and more terrifying, and the movement also became louder. Under the bombardment of the countless lightning bolts, the mountain peak shattered more and more thoroughly. At the beginning, during the first bombardment, the mountain peak could still be seen to be formed by countless stones piled together. However, as time passed, as it suffered more and more bombardment, the mountain peak became more and more finely fragmented. Not long after, the entire mountain peak could no longer be seen by the details piled up together. On the contrary, the mountain peak appeared extremely solid, complete, and sturdy. This naturally wasn't because there were too many bombardments, but because the mountain peak had reformed and became complete again. It was because the mountain peak had been smashed so thoroughly that the fragments that formed the mountain peak were so fine that they were indistinguishable to the naked eye. In the end, after they gathered together, ordinary people could no longer see the existence of the cracks. And since the cracks couldn't be seen, the mountain peak naturally appeared relatively complete, and no cracks could be seen. This was why such a strange phenomenon occurred. If Luo Fan were to leave this place at this time, this mountain would definitely collapse immediately, turning into a vast amount of dust that would scatter in all directions. However, at this moment, with Luo Fan's existence and suppression, even if the mountain peak had been smashed to such a degree, and even if the fragments formed were so fine that they could no longer be seen with the naked eye, the mountain peak still maintained its original form. It was even to the extent that because Luo Fan suppression was too strong, it even made this mountain seem even more solid than before it was bombarded. This process lasted for 9 days and 9 nights. During these 9 days and 9 nights, Luo Fan's actions didn't change at all. He had been constantly injecting his will into the laws to search for the source of the law's anger, to search for the remnant will of the creator of the world. This action had clearly touched that rule, and it had even touched the city. As a result, the city was constantly trembling, and the seawater that filled the entire city was also trembling endlessly. Under such circumstances, after 9 days and 9 nights, there were very few buildings in the city that were still intact. Other than these extremely rare few buildings that were still in good condition, all the other buildings within the city had already been destroyed by the many intertwining shockwaves. Currently, all that was left were ruins. However, due to the mysterious effects of the laws, not a single living being had died in the city even at this stage. At the very least, not a single person had died because of the tremors. Such a strange change might not have caught the attention of all living beings in the beginning, but it was clear that as time passed, after 9 days and 9 nights, even the most careless of living beings had noticed this anomaly. Could it be that the world is changing itself? At this moment, this was what the living beings in the city guessed about the current situation. After all, no matter how they looked at it, it seemed like the world was changing itself. If it was an external attack, how could they be protected? How was it possible that the entire city, or rather the entire world, was almost completely destroyed, but not a single living being had died? This must be because the world still had a lot of energy left, which was why it could cause such a situation. Evidently, under the attack of external forces, the possibility of this world having excess power was relatively small. After 9 days and 9 nights, The pitch-black liquid floating above Luo Fan's head had already expanded thousands of times. Chapter 2889. This city was completely different from how it had been 9 days and 9 nights ago. It seemed like it was difficult to treat it as the same place as the city that had been like a world 9 days and 9 nights ago. After this period of development, the law formed by the original creator of the world had unknowingly expanded thousands of times. That's right, this law was constantly expanding under Luo Fan's actions. Along with this expansion came the invisible willpower that existed within this law, that had given birth to the emotion of anger. As Luo Fan continued to pour his spirit will into it and traced it back to its source, it had become more and more intense. It was so much so that it had gone a step deeper into the city, manipulating even more power in the city, causing the destruction of the city to become more and more thorough. Let me see when I can regain my consciousness. At this moment, Luo Fan's eyes seemed to penetrate endless barriers and see the true appearance of the depths of the law. The wave of anger continued to expand, and as it did, the pitch-black liquid in the sky also continued to expand. The power and destructive power it released also continued to increase. However, this was nothing to Luo Fan. Not to mention the fact that this incarnation could guide the suppression power from the other incarnation. Just by relying on the incarnation's material, it could completely ignore the extremely monotonous attack that was purely manifested in the form of thunder and lightning. Therefore, he allowed this anger to expand, and he was not worried that it would cause any harm to him. On the contrary, he was looking forward to it. He hoped that this swelling anger would eventually trigger some crucial qualitative change. At Luo Fan's level, he naturally knew that emotions could be transformed. In other words, under certain circumstances, the emotion of anger could be transformed into joy, sorrow, pain, bitterness, and many other emotions. In other words, when the conditions were met, even a wave of anger would be enough to transform into a state of mind where all kinds of complicated emotions intertwined like normal living beings. Once this state appeared, the remnant of the willpower hidden in the depths of the law that Luo Fan had yet to find would definitely change. It might even be completely activated in an instant and become even more complete and perfect. All that was needed was for this current wave of anger to expand, strengthen, and transform. Of course, this could be regarded as the second choice. Luo Fan's greatest reliance was, of course, at this moment, he was using his spirit and will to search for the will that existed in the depths of the laws, the will that was left behind by the creator of the world. If he could find the remnant willpower, there was naturally no need to say anything at all. Just himself would be enough to activate the willpower. Although he might not be able to make the willpower perfect immediately, it would be enough to give the willpower a chance to be complete in the future. As for which method would work, it would depend on whether Luo Fan was faster or the evolution of the anger was faster. Luo Fan continued to search, allowing his spirit and willpower to continuously penetrate the depths of the law. In the end, when the 9 days and 9 nights were about to pass, the anger that existed in the law finally expanded to a certain limit. A subtle cracking sound came from within the laws. At this instant, all the huge movements in the entire city stopped at this moment. It was as if time had completely stopped at this moment. Has it begun? Seeing this scene, an inexplicable smile appeared on Luo Fan's face. At this moment, even the pitch-black liquid above his head stopped at the same time. All the power had completely stopped in midair and was motionless. This situation was clearly caused by a huge change that was closely related to the existence of this city. And at this moment, the only thing that could change was that law. At this moment, the anger that had already swelled to a certain limit started to have countless invisible cracks appearing from within amidst the crackling sounds. As these cracks appeared, other emotions began to emerge from the anger. They began to interweave and mix, gradually turning into a more and more complete emotional system. Unknowingly, a wave of anger seemed to have turned into the heart of a living being, Although it didn't have a core or a true main body, only various emotions. Soon after, the law began to tremble violently. A ray of light flashed from the depths of the law and directly penetrated an endless distance. From a place that even Luo Fan couldn't reach after spending 9 days and 9 nights, it directly arrived at the mass of emotions. It directly occupied the core of the mass of emotions and became the main body of the mass of emotions. After arriving here, the mass of emotions began to rapidly condense. A subtle, blurry feeling gradually emerged from the amalgamation of emotions. The mass of emotions gradually gave birth to a feeling of soul, a feeling that was complete, independent, inseparable, undistorted, and unchangeable gradually emerged from it. This was the charm of a powerhouse's soul. It was the charm of a true powerhouse's soul. At this moment, faced with this change, Luo Fan's smile finally blossomed completely. Although he didn't find the remnant of the will in the end, at least the current changes had told him that his plan had succeeded. He had finally activated the will of the world will. At this moment, the spirit light continued to expand and grow stronger within the body of emotions. At this moment, the law began to shrink continuously. The frequency at which it shrank was no different from the frequency at which the light expanded and strengthened. It was as if the light was constantly absorbing the law in an indescribable way to strengthen itself. This process seemed to be extremely long, but also extremely fast. In this state where even time was stagnant, it was completely impossible to determine how much time had passed. After an unknown period of time, everything calmed down. However, the law had completely disappeared. In its place was the figure of a living being hovering in the void, looking around with an indescribable expression. "I've been resurrected," he murmured, his voice containing an extremely complicated emotion. "Thank you for saving me, fellow cultivator." At this moment, he saw Luo Fan below. His heart skipped a beat, and he already knew why he was able to completely recover from that near-death state. An inexplicable sense of gratitude surged from the bottom of his heart, and he took a step forward, arriving in front of Luo Fan in an instant. His figure was not that of a human, but an extremely strange form of body. It also did not conform to Luo Fan's sense of beauty. However, because he was the creator of a world, he possessed the characteristics of a born Taoism aptitude, which revealed a perfect charm. "We're just helping each other." Luo Fan smiled. At this moment, the sky trembled slightly, or rather, the sea trembled slightly. A huge whirlpool appeared above their heads, and an indescribable suction was produced from the whirlpool, acting directly on the creator in front of Luo Fan. The suction was so powerful that the creator felt his body gradually losing control due to the suction. He began to float uncontrollably, continuously approaching the whirlpool. In that instant, the creator of the world's expression turned extremely ugly. "What the hell is this?" he roared furiously. As the power in his body surged, unimaginable power was released from his body, instantly stirring the endless seawater around him. Or rather, the endless power of the tribulations was under his control at this moment. It began to transform under his will, surging towards the huge whirlpool in the sky, and resolutely collided with it. Boom, 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 boom. The whirlpool shook violently, vaguely showing signs of instability. Luo Fan raised his head and frowned deeply when he saw this. "He's interfering again. It was the same for my previous incarnation, and it's the same for the creator now. Could he be collecting the wills of the world creators that entered the sea?" Such a thought flashed through his mind. The scene in front of him was quite familiar to him. Previously, when the former incarnation abandoned everything and only left his own self to charge out of the suppressive force, the vortex that represented the will of the world appeared in front of him and directly sucked in the remnant self of the former incarnation. During the entire process, the former incarnation did not even have the ability to resist at all. Now, the world creator that had just been revived had only just appeared, and the whirlpool had appeared once again, trying to suck him in once more. This made him suspect that the world's will's goal was to have a sufficiently powerful self-consciousness. However, this kind of words did not make sense either. After all, if that was the goal of the world's creator, then its previous behavior was a little strange. After all, it had used all its means to suppress the self-consciousness of the world creators. Otherwise, Luo Fan wouldn't have spent so much effort to resurrect the creator of this world. At this moment, the whirlpool began to slowly spin. As it spun, the control over the seawater, or rather, the power of the tribulations that was constantly charging at it and releasing destructive power, seemed to have been seized in an instant. In the blink of an eye, it was completely under the world creator's control and began to gently fill the surroundings of the whirlpool. It even vaguely showed signs of joining the whirlpool, making the whirlpool seem even larger. Although the world creator could slightly control the seawater and a portion of the endless tribulations that existed in this world due to the previous transformation, he could only control an insignificant portion of it. However, he could only control an insignificant portion of it. How is such a level of control enough for the worlds to look at? If the worlds did not mind, he could indeed control some of the tribulations to achieve some of his goals, such as carrying out certain destruction or changes that he needed. However, if the world wanted it, even if he expended all his energy and paid all the price that he could, he would not be able to control even the slightest bit of control. Under such circumstances, he would be able to figure out what had just happened. Not only did the world creator want to control the tribulations in front of the world's will, but he also wanted to use the tribulations to attack the whirlpool formed by the world's will. No matter how one looked at it, it was like using the tentacles of an octopus to attack an octopus. How could he succeed? At this moment, the world creator reacted. The power in his body erupted once again, and the endless power instantly gathered into a world around him. Like a fist, it fiercely charged towards the whirlpool that was growing larger and larger. In the end, it smashed into the whirlpool and collided with it. Boom, 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 boom. Earth-shattering rumbles erupted from the whirlpool in an instant. In the blink of an eye, the terrifying commotion turned into ripples that spread out in all directions. Along with the ripples were terrifying shock waves that could shatter a part of the world and cut off a thick layer of the seabed. Shock waves. The commotion lasted for a long time before it stopped. When it came to a complete stop, Luo Fan looked over and found that the vortex that was the manifestation of the will of the heavens and earth above his head was completely undamaged. On the other hand, the world formed by the power of the creator of the world had completely disappeared, as if it had never existed. Just by looking at the situation of the whirlpool, one would even suspect that the terrifying commotion from before was just an illusion of the spectators. How could this be? The world creator cried out in horror. Chapter 2891. The heaven and earth creator's expression froze. How could he forget? Although he did not feel anything at that time, he only felt as if he was controlled by some unimaginably terrifying power. Then his body and his world were thrown into this world. After that, everything became blurry and hazy, and he even forgot about the passage of time. When he came back to his senses, it was time for the anger that Luo Fan had guided to derive into countless emotions, and then reaccommodate that part of his self, allowing that part of his self to be nourished by the many emotions to be restored to its complete state. However, he only needed to think about everything that had happened before, and everything was crystal clear to him. It could even be said to be unforgettable. So how could he forget it? Was it a punishment? Or could it be that everything that happened before was just a preparation to capture me now? Or was it a remedy for me to break free from its plan? The heaven and earth creator murmured. At this moment, when he understood that the worlds will have been targeting him from the beginning, he instantly had many guesses. After all, he was a heaven and earth creator. As for heaven and earth creators, their personalities might be different. Some might be relatively timid and cowardly, but there were no fools. Perhaps the heaven and earth creator was not the kind of powerhouse that could derive countless schemes with a single thought. However, when things came to a head, he would definitely be able to make the corresponding deductions and make the corresponding guesses. Perhaps. As for the specifics, you'll have to find out for yourself. Luo Fan only smiled faintly. The heaven and earth creator regained his composure, and an indescribable determination appeared on his face. I must find out the answer. I'm not the kind of person who can be schemed against and not react. Even if the one who schemed against me might be the world's will of this world, I will still do so. Then he descended and entered the pavilion that Luo Fan was at. He appeared in front of Luo Fan and bowed to Luo Fan. Next, I'll leave my safety to you, fellow Taoist. On the other hand, I won't refuse any of your requests. The creator of this world was rather clear-headed. Previously, he had not been captured by the will of the world and was still able to freely converse with Luo Fan. Clearly, Luo Fan had used some sort of method. In other words, in the following days, he could only stay by Luo Fan's side at all times. At the very least, he had to stay within the range of Luo Fan's power. Only then would he be able to prevent the will of the world from seizing any gaps and taking him away. In this way, a fact was determined. For a very long period of time, he could only rely on Luo Fan. He could only follow Luo Fan wherever he wanted to go, and obviously, Luo Fan had no obligation to protect him all the time. Although Luo Fan did not let up when facing the world will, it did not mean that he would always be like this. If he did not express anything, who knew when Luo Fan would completely ignore him? Therefore, he wisely expressed his loyalty at this moment. Hearing this, Luo Fan only smiled. Don't worry, fellow Taoist. Didn't I say it before? We are just supporting each other. The creator finally relaxed at this moment and smiled. No matter what, fellow Taoist knows more than I do. Feel free to instruct me. Luo Fan didn't say anything more. He smiled and said, our strength is still too weak. So, we need to find more companions. The creator came to a realization. He knew that in the following days, they would most likely have to move from one world to another and carry out everything that Luo Fan had done in this city. In this way, their strength seemed to be able to continue to grow. However, at this moment, he suddenly thought of a possibility. His expression changed slightly. Should we change what we do next? Luo Fan looked at the creator doubtfully and asked, why do you think so, fellow Taoist? The creator replied, the world has already compromised with fellow Taoist. Next, when we activate the wills of the other world founders, it might not appear again. If it doesn't appear, the other world founders might not trust fellow Taoist as much as I do. His words were rather realistic. Every creator of the world was confident in themselves. Even he was the same. If the will of heaven and earth had not appeared when he was reborn, and had not displayed a terrifying power that he could not resist, and had not made him feel despair, he would never have thought that his strength was not enough, and it was impossible for him to surrender to Luo Fan. Even if Luo Fan had activated his consciousness and was considered his savior, it was the same. At most, he would leave behind a means of communication with Luo Fan, and then he would leave to investigate the will of the world and find a way to resist the will of the world. If he was like that, the other world founders would not be much different. Hearing this, Luo Fan smiled. If they don't believe me, so be it. I believe that there will be fellow Taoists who will believe me in the end. I only need those who believe in me. He had naturally thought about the problem that the world founders were worried about, but he did not think it would be much of a problem. After all, most world founders would not stay with him just because he had saved their lives. However, the personalities of world founders were different. There would still be some who would travel with him because he had saved their lives or because of other considerations. Clearly, it was enough for him, even if it was only a small portion of them. As long as there were enough of them, he would definitely be able to gather enough power to deal with the world will. Furthermore, he believed that such a problem would only arise at the beginning. No matter how confident the world founders were, they could not completely ignore the words of the other world founders. If there were enough world founders following him, and all of them vowed that what Luo Fan said was true, it was very likely that the other world founders would be skeptical. Once they were skeptical and started following Luo Fan for a short period of time, they would soon be able to see the fate of the world founders who did not believe him. Once such an outcome appeared, their doubts would turn into firm belief. Therefore, perhaps the world would not act in front of him, causing a portion of the founders to leave out of distrust of Luo Fan. However, the number of people who would leave would definitely not be as many as the founders thought. At the very least, it was a ratio that Luo Fan could accept. He naturally did not need to explain such considerations too clearly. Although the world founders were a little confused at the beginning and did not know why Luo Fan was so indifferent about the number of world founders, they quickly grasped Luo Fan's thoughts as they pondered deeply. Perhaps he would not be as clear as Luo Fan about the direction of the final development of the matter, but he already had a vague understanding of it. So that's the case. I understand now. The world founder nodded. Fellow Taoist, do you want to collect the remaining living beings in this world? Luo Fan looked around and asked the world founders. The world founders looked around with a complicated look in their eyes. There were quite a large number of these creatures, and their species were almost identical to those that had been born in the world that he had opened up. This made him feel extremely close to these living beings. It was as if he was looking at his own limbs growing out of his body. However, the birth of these living beings was not under his control. The appearance of these living beings was completely the result of the world will's activation. There were even various powers that belonged to this world among them, as well as other things. It could be said that these living beings were no longer pure. In fact, there were even some schemes of the world hidden within them. This understanding made him feel extremely repulsed by these living beings. This repulsion and familiarity intertwined, forming his complicated emotions. After a long while, he sighed and made a grabbing motion with his hand. Boundless power surged out from the void, and the countless surviving creatures turned into streams of light and rushed into his sleeve. In the blink of an eye, they were all sucked into his sleeve. At a glance, Luo Fan discovered that there was a world that had just been created in his sleeve. It was a world that completely simulated the environment of the city from before. If the living beings who had been sucked into it were slightly more sensitive, they might not even be able to tell the difference between this world and the city from before. In fact, they might even suspect that the destruction of the city from before was just a figment of their imagination. Evidently, the world founders could not bear to see these living beings die in front of them. Even though these living beings were still alive, they were only alive for now. Once the world founders left, the ruins of the city would lose the suppression of the laws, and the laws would definitely become chaotic. The city was located in the depths of the sea, and it was constantly enduring the pressure and impact of the endless seawater. Once the rules became chaotic, it was inevitable for the city to collapse completely. Once this collapse was discovered, it would be a calamity for the living beings that were still alive. In other words, if the creator of this world didn't care about these living beings, then what awaited these living beings was absolute annihilation. If it was an ordinary world founders, perhaps they would not care about these living beings and leave them to fend for themselves. However, it was clear that the world founders were not that kind of existence. To him, the existence of these living beings was obviously rather important. At the very least, they were very important to him. This could be seen from the fact that when the world founders turned into the laws, they still thought of ways to protect these living beings even when they were enduring the impact and pressure that caused the entire city to tremble violently. Not a single one of the living beings died during the changes. If the other world founders could not even protect themselves, why would they still have the thought to protect those living beings? Faced with this situation, Luo Fan only smiled faintly and did not say anything. In fact, he had already seen through the choice of the world founders. At this moment, his actions were completely within his expectations. However, since he had seen through it and did not say it out loud, he naturally did not need to comment on his actions. He immediately turned around and left the pavilion, heading towards the surface of the sea. As he left the pavilion, the world founders also left the pavilion, and the moment they left, they let out a slight sigh. The instant they left the pavilion, along with the mountain peak, completely collapsed, turning into countless fine powder. With a slight sway, the surrounding seawater became turbid. By the time the seawater became clear again, the mountain peak and the pavilion on top of it had completely disappeared. Evidently, after losing Luo fan suppression, the mountain and the pavilion had completely returned to their original state, the state where they were turned into fine powder after being struck by lightning. The state of the powder clearly had nothing to do with each other. Under the washing of the seawater, the powder directly fused with the seawater. Then, as the seawater surged, it dispersed into a large area of seawater. In the end, this place became empty, with nothing related to the mountain remaining. At the same time, the part of the city that had survived was still constantly collapsing and shattering. It looked like some unimaginable power was slowly erasing the traces of the city from the bottom of the sea, or in other words, erasing it from the world. Faced with this situation, the gaze of the world founders became even more complicated. After all, this was a world that was born from him. It contained his worldview, his comprehension of cultivation, the world, the universe, and all things. Now that everything was gradually collapsing and being destroyed behind him, how could he not feel complicated? However, even though he was in a complicated mood, he didn't do anything to stop this from happening. Chapter 2892. Luo Fan brought the heaven and earth creator and quickly rushed out of the sea. Their next target was obviously the next place that simulated the chaotic state of the world. There were countless of such existences in this world. Although this location was not considered too special in this world, there were quite a number of such derivatives. Therefore, they did not have to go far to find several derivatives for them to choose from. That's right, not just one, but several. After all, the derivatives of this world that had fused with other worlds were not arranged in a straight line. Instead, they existed in an almost uniform manner. Under such circumstances, in any location, in any direction, there would obviously be derivatives that could be quickly found. With the previous experiment, the next step was naturally to rely on quantity to win. Therefore, Luo Fan was not picky. After looking at the distribution of the derivatives, he chose a derivative that was not the closest, but was closer to the surrounding derivatives. Derivatives could exist in any form in this world. Islands, underwater cities, palaces, clouds, energy rules clouds, rules space, even fragments of time and dimensions at this moment. The derivative that Luo Fan chose was a cloud that existed in the void. This cluster of clouds was quite wonderful. It seemed to be no different from the other clusters of clouds in this world. But Luo Fan could clearly feel the charm of another world from it. That charm was rather strange. It was a charm that could only be born from a unique worldview. This also meant that the clump of clouds was definitely derived from the worldview of a certain unique creature. If such an existence did not come from another world and was the work of another world's creator, Luo Fan would not believe it at all. Faced with such a situation, Luo Fan only smiled and rushed up with the creator. Not long after, they crashed into the cloud. In just a few days, the cloud suddenly collapsed. Everything that belonged to the cloud completely collapsed and became part of this world. At the same time, a creator rushed out of the cloud and into the distance. In the blink of an eye, he disappeared into the sky. This creator was not the one that Luo Fan had brought out from the underwater city. Instead, it was the creator that Luo Fan had just rescued in the cloud. Obviously, the worries of the underwater city's creator had come true. Because of Luo Fan's existence, the will of the world did not attack the creator. Because the will of the world didn't do anything to him, the creator of the cloud world didn't believe Luo Fan's words. He didn't care about the invisible threat of the will of the world at all. He only did Luo Fan a favor before turning around to enjoy his rare freedom. Faced with such a situation, what else could Luo Fan say? He could only hope that he could live a little longer. After the cloud dissipated, Luo Fan and the creator of the underwater city appeared where the cloud was. Luo Fan's expression was rather calm, but the creator of the underwater city was rather regretful. What a pity! There's nothing to be regretful about. We've already made it very clear. If he doesn't believe us, that's his problem. No one can force him to believe us, Luo Fan said calmly. The creator of the underwater city could only sigh softly. Let's go. We still have a very important mission, Luo Fan instructed before turning around and heading towards another derivative. This time, the derivative was a ball of wind. It was extremely unique. It seemed to be formless, but it had a strong sense of existence. It also had a strong charm that belonged to another world. After a few days, the ball of wind dissipated. Other than Luo Fan and the creator of the underwater city, there was another creator that seemed to be formed from a ball of wind beside them. This was, of course, the original creator of the wind. Completing the rescue of this creator in a few days meant that Luo Fan had a rather deep understanding of this act of rescuing people. Looking at the current situation, it was clear that although the creator of the universe did not completely believe in what Luo Fan had said, he was still somewhat skeptical. Hence, he decided to follow Luo Fan and the others and see how the situation turned out. At this moment, without waiting for Luo Fan to say anything, the creator of the wind suddenly looked into the distance. At this moment, Luo Fan smiled and said, "There's no need to look. That's the will of the world dealing with that person from before." At this moment, in an extremely distant place, an indescribable wave was spreading in all directions. The wave was extremely strange. Despite being so far away, the creator of the wind still felt a kind of pressure from the bottom of his heart, as if he was being targeted by a natural enemy. This feeling was extremely familiar. Back when he lost his self-consciousness, he seemed to have experienced something similar. "Are we not going to save him?" the creator of the cloud world asked. "We can't. Not only is the distance too far, but there must also be some kind of barrier between us that we can't cross for a period of time. Even if we rush over, the matter will already be over," Luo Fan said plainly. He did not confirm this, but he knew that it must be the truth. To the will of the world, the threat that he, Luo Fan, posed to it was real. Of course, it was not a threat to its existence, but a threat to its act of taking away another creator. Hence, to prevent Luo Fan from getting involved, it would definitely make preparations once it acted. It would definitely have sufficient means to prevent him from getting involved before the creator was taken away. Putting everything else aside, the fact that it did not act before and only acted when the creator was so far away was the best proof. It went without saying that the will of the world had a strong desire for the creator of the world. However, even with such a strong desire, it was still able to endure until now. If it wasn't for the sake of making Luo Fan unable to participate as much as possible, it wouldn't make sense. Such a distance was nothing to Luo Fan and the others. If they really wanted to rush over, an instant would be enough. Luo Fan was well aware of this. The other creators were well aware of it, and the will of the world was even more aware of it. Since that was the case, if it still dared to act at such a time and from such a distance, it was clear that it had made full preparations and was confident that it could prevent Luo Fan from getting there in time. Hearing this, the creator of the cloud world fell into deep thought and did not say anything else. At this moment, his trust in Luo Fan's words had increased a little. Of course, it only increased a little. If he wanted the creator to completely trust Luo Fan, this alone was clearly not enough. Of course, Luo Fan did not hope for the creator to completely trust him at this moment. If it was so easy to trust him, then he would not deserve to be called a creator. At this moment, all he needed was for the creator of this world to be skeptical and stay by his side. That was enough. As for the question of complete trust, as long as he went to more places and experienced more things, he would naturally completely trust him. As they spoke, the commotion on the other side completely disappeared. The world returned to normal, as if nothing had happened. From the looks of it, it was obvious that the will of the world had completed its goal and taken away the creator. Luo Fan merely sighed and no longer paid any attention to it. He turned around and led the two creators to another derivative. This derivative was a mysterious space-time hidden in the depths of the void. Similarly, in just a few days, that mysterious space-time was annihilated once again. A creator left that mysterious space-time and headed into the distance alone. This was clearly the original creator of that mysterious space-time. He clearly did not believe Luo Fan's words, even with the two founders of the world testifying at the side. After he left, Luo Fan and the other two walked out of the void. This time, Luo Fan did not even have the interest to sigh with emotion. He directly led the other two to another derivative. Just like this, Luo Fan's team grew stronger and stronger over the next few years. Unknowingly, there were already hundreds of creators following him. Of course, at the same time, the number of world creators that left him was also not small. Although not all creators were extremely resolute and would not believe it unless they saw it with their own eyes or experienced it for themselves, the majority of creators were clearly more resolute than ordinary living beings. Under such circumstances, they would obviously have doubts about the words of Luo Fan and the other founders of the world. The only difference was how much they doubted it. The few that doubted it followed Luo Fan, intending to see what happened to the other creators. The few that doubted it would directly turn around and leave. At most, they would do Luo Fan a favor and explore the secrets of this world. In the past few years, the number of creators that left Luo Fan's team was probably more than 100. On the whole, it was equal to the number of creators that followed Luo Fan. Apart from the creators that joined Luo Fan's team later on, the other creators' doubts towards Luo Fan had completely disappeared. After all, they were by Luo Fan's side, and from time to time, they could sense the movements of the world's willpower that had left. If it happened once, they would still be somewhat doubtful, thinking that the world's creators were courting death. If it happened twice, that would be fine. Perhaps the world was just that dangerous, and a creator could accidentally touch some sort of taboo. If it happened 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, or even 100 times, then even the thickest of creators would not be able to deceive themselves that it was just a coincidence. Therefore, the longer a creator followed Luo Fan, the more they believed in Luo Fan. In contrast, the pioneers who followed Luo Fan later on were different. Although they had seen the movements caused by the world's will, there were still relatively few of them. With such a small number, it was difficult for them to be completely convinced. Therefore, there would naturally be doubts remaining. Perhaps we can try a stronger challenge. On this day, Luo Fan smiled at the other creators. Hearing this, the other creators were slightly taken aback. A stronger challenge? Was going against the world's will not the most difficult challenge? I'd like to hear the details. As the most experienced creator, the creator of the underwater city joined in the fun and asked, "Don't you think that island is very different from the others?" Luo Fan smiled and pointed at a huge island in the distance. The creators were slightly taken aback. They had encountered quite a number of derivatives over the years, and the derivatives that existed in the form of islands could be said to be the most common. Under such circumstances, the number of islands they had visited was naturally quite a lot. Compared to the islands they had walked through before, apart from being slightly bigger, what was so special about this island? Luo Fan looked at the expressions of the other heaven and earth founders and knew that they did not see anything. However, he was not interested in explaining it to them. After all, as long as they entered, they would definitely be able to feel that the island was different from the previous islands. Immediately, he led the many creators towards the island. Along the way, they passed by a few derivatives, but they did not stop to release the world creator among the derivatives. Very soon, they arrived on the island. The size of the island had reached an unimaginable level. From the outside, it seemed to be just a slightly larger island. However, when one looked down from above, they would find that even if they combined all the worlds that they had opened up, they would not be able to compare to this island. It's so vast now. How vast is this world? How powerful must the existence that created this world be? At this moment, similar thoughts flashed through the minds of many creators. Chapter 2893. Any world that entered this world would inevitably shrink. This was not because this world wanted to suppress other worlds, but because this world had requirements for the essence and power of other worlds. Essence and power that did not meet the requirements would be eliminated in the process of fusing with this world. As a result, the essence and power of other worlds that entered this world would naturally be much smaller than before. Generally, the greater the difference between a world's requirements and this world's, the more it would shrink after entering this world. This was something that the founders of this world had already confirmed after seeing many worlds. If it was like that for other worlds, then the world in front of them should be the same. However, even though the world in front of them had shrunk a lot, it was still so huge and vast in the end. How could the founders not be shocked by its original size? Compared to this world, our world is perhaps hundreds of millions of times smaller. This was the judgment that appeared in the hearts of the many founders. With this judgment, their expressions became even more solemn. At this moment, Luo Fan didn't care about the shock in the hearts of the world founders. He just led them into another island. It looked like an island from the outside, but after passing through the invisible boundary, it was as if they had entered a completely independent world. This world was extremely perfect. There were continents, oceans, mountains, rivers, hills, forests, grasslands, deserts, snowy mountains, seas of fire, and all sorts of other sceneries that could be found in any other world could be found in this world. In such a world, there were also innumerable living beings. There were all sorts of different kinds of living beings, and they were different from the beauty standards of the many founders. However, they all vaguely followed some indescribable principle, showing an indescribable beauty of balance. At once, many of the world's founders recognized what kind of creature the born Taoism aptitude in this world was. Once they recognized it, they were naturally able to determine what the founder of this world looked like. That image was also very different from their beauty standards. If it was taken out alone, they wouldn't think that it was a perfect image. However, at this time, this image had the perfect charm of a normal born Taoism aptitude. It was full of the charm that only born Taoism aptitude had, which any creator of the world would admit. It's like there's a feeling of perfection, just like one of the founders suddenly murmured, glancing at Luo Fan out of the corner of his eye. Indeed, the appearance of this born Taoism aptitude, compared to the appearance of the born Taoism aptitude of other worlds, had a more subtle feeling, and that was the feeling of perfection. This was also the biggest difference between Luo Fan and the other founders of the universe, apart from the power and might of his body. On Luo Fan's body, there was also that indescribable feeling of perfection. His words caused many of the world founders to be slightly stunned. Then, they all looked at Luo Fan thoughtfully. Evidently, with this reminder, many of the founders of this world had realized why the natural Tao physique in this world seemed to have something familiar to them. It was clearly the special charm of perfection that only Luo Fan had. As expected, it's still there. At this time, Luo Fan said this. With a light stride, he had already brought the many founders across an endless distance, directly arriving at a seemingly ordinary corner of this world. A figure of the born Taoism aptitude of this world instantly appeared in front of them. This figure seemed to be just an ordinary living being, without the slightest bit of extraordinary or mysterious. However, at this moment, when he saw the many founders of the universe, he was only slightly stunned before smiling bitterly. He did not show the slightest bit of panic and fear that ordinary living beings would have when they saw the world founders. He looked like a person who opened his door and saw his neighbor outside, intending to knock on his door. They existed inside and asked Luo Fan, "Are you guys here to kill me?" This existence was, of course, the creator of this world. However, he clearly could not confirm the identities of Luo Fan and the others. At this time, he only regarded them as the culprits who had caused him to be in such a predicament. Since he had identified them as the culprits, when they appeared in front of him, he would naturally think that these culprits were here to deal with him, who had originally escaped the net. There was no problem with this logic at all. Hearing this, the other world founders were all stunned. Evidently, they did not expect that there would be a day when they would be regarded as the culprits. "Why do you say that, fellow? We're here to seek your help." Luo Fan only smiled at this time. At this time, he understood the thoughts of the world founders. After all, as the first outsider to appear in this world after he entered, it was very normal for him to be regarded as the culprit. Help! You want me to give up my life to help you? The world founder smiled bitterly again. Did this not make sense? At this moment, Luo Fan only shook his head. He knew that if he continued to speak, perhaps he would be able to make the world founders believe him. However, that would waste too much time and too much saliva. It was better to directly save the world founders and let them regain the power that they were supposed to have before anything else. Once they regained the power that they were supposed to have, they would not need to say anything for the world founders to completely believe them. As such, with a slight thought, he sent a thought to the other pioneers of the world. In an instant, the other world founders understood his thoughts. Waves of mysterious power were released from their bodies, and under Luo Fan's guidance, they charged towards the laws of this world. At this moment, the laws of this world distorted violently. The entire world, or rather, the entire island, underwent an earth-shattering change due to this distortion. An unimaginably terrifying pressure appeared out of nowhere and directly pressed down on the world founders. The world founders felt as if thousands of arrows had pierced through his heart, and he felt as if his life was about to be completely lost in the next moment. An incomparably intense fear was born in the depths of his body at this moment. "You're still denying it," he roared in his heart, and his entire body completely collapsed in the void. At the same time, an indescribable willpower was born in the depths of the laws of this world. The moment this spirit will appeared, it took control of one of the laws. Following that, this control began to rapidly spread to other laws and other nomological laws. In just the blink of an eye, it had completely taken control of the laws of this world. As the laws of this world were completely controlled, the willpower instantly obtained supreme power. It directly unleashed an unimaginably terrifying might that swept through the entire world like a hurricane. At this moment, the world shook violently, as if the entire world had instantly come to life. It's much simpler than before. At this moment, Luo Fan sighed and stopped guiding the various powers, allowing the powers produced by the world founders to quickly retract. In the blink of an eye, they completely disappeared without a trace, no longer affecting the outside world. Facing this change, the willpower paused for a moment. Then all the changes calmed down. A figure appeared out of nowhere in the void, not far away from Luo Fan and the others. It was the figure of the creator of the world from before. However, compared to before, he no longer had the appearance of an ordinary mortal. Right now, he was already extremely powerful. In fact, he was even more powerful than many of the cultivators who had established the world here. Just by standing there and exuding his aura, he already seemed to be able to control space-time and dimensions. "Fellow Taoist, do you believe me now?" Luo Fan asked. The world founder was slightly stunned, then smiled bitterly. His aura gradually retracted, and in the blink of an eye, it completely disappeared as if he had never appeared. At this moment, his entire body was filled with an indescribable charm of perfection. Hovering there, he had an indescribable bearing. However, he had already completely recovered the power and strength that the creator of the world should have. "Looks like fellow Taoists are only a step ahead of me." The world founder sighed at Luo Fan. "We are a step ahead of you, but fellow Taoist Luo Fan isn't. He's the savior of all of us. Now, he's our protector," one of the world founders said with a sigh. "Protector? Could it be because of perfection as well?" The world founder carefully looked at Luo Fan with a bewildered expression. The reason why this world was so special, the reason why it could form such a vast island in this world, and the reason why the creator of this world didn't completely lose his self-consciousness like the other creators and turn into some special existence of rules in this world was actually very simple. But it was only because this world was also a perfect world. That's right, this was a world similar to the perfect world from before. It had already gone through 7 great tribulations and reached the limit that the simulated chaotic state could endure. In the end, it was bestowed with the simulated chaotic state and became a perfect world. This proved the conjecture of the other creator of the perfect world. His own perfect world was clearly not the only perfect world in the simulated chaotic state. In addition to his perfect world, there were many more perfect worlds. As a world that had been bestowed with the simulated chaotic state and reached the highest level that the simulated chaotic state could endure, it naturally had its own special features. It was a great world formed by the tribulation level. For this perfect world, it could not be crushed and destroyed like it did with other worlds. Perhaps this world would be able to devour a perfect world, assimilate it, or even completely suppress the creator of this world. However, it was impossible to directly break it down and turn the creator of the world into some sort of law, just like how it was faced with other worlds. After all, no matter what, this perfect world was an existence that had been acknowledged by the simulated chaotic state. Even if this world was formed by the tribulation level and was under the control of the existence that was suspected to be the embodiment of the simulated chaotic state, it could not directly overturn the original decision of the simulated chaotic state and directly deny the recognition, gifts, and rewards of the simulated chaotic state. Therefore, the final result was that this perfect world turned into an island in this world without any reservations, just like the perfect world that Luo Fan had opened up previously. As the founder of this perfect world, the world founder in front of him did not end up in the predicament of the other world founders. Even though he was almost completely suppressed, he still maintained the integrity of his consciousness. Before this, the creator of the perfect world did not know the reason for all of this. However, as his potential was stimulated by Luo Fan and the others through ingenious means, and he regained his power and strength, he naturally understood many things that he did not understand in the past. He knew what he had been wasting all this while. That was why he made such a judgment. Although it's not complete, that's what I mean, Luo Fan said at this moment. In that case, what about the enemy? The world founder asked with a solemn expression. At this moment, Luo Fan only smiled and did not hide anything. He explained the situation that they were facing to the world founder. Hearing this explanation, the world founder showed an inexplicable look of anger on his face. The will of the heavens. Then let me see how much confidence he has. He muttered. Obviously, he believed in Luo Fan's judgment, unlike the other world founders who were only skeptical about it like Luo Fan. However, what was more obvious was that he did not think that he needed to rely on Luo Fan to resist the will of the world. Chapter 2894. For those who believe themselves to be strong, the most intolerable thing was to doubt their strength. Evidently, this perfect world pioneer was the one who believed himself to be strong. More obviously, if Luo Fan were to tell the other party that he could do it, but the other party could not do it, the perfect world creator would not be able to accept it. In fact, it might even erase the kindness he had shown him previously. Under such circumstances, Luo Fan was very wise to keep his mouth shut. He just wished the creator of the perfect world in front of him good luck. The perfect world pioneer was naturally quite satisfied with Luo Fan's attitude. If Luo Fan were to say that he was not strong enough, the perfect world pioneer's confidence would not be shaken, but he would definitely feel a little annoyed. Now, Luo Fan's silence allowed the perfect world pioneer a lot of peace. Luo Fan did not stay any longer and left the island with the other world pioneers. Compared to the other world pioneers, this island was more stable and could even become the foundation for the world pioneers to establish a foothold in this world, just like the island that Luo Fan's main body was on. Therefore, under such circumstances, the perfect world pioneer naturally could not just abandon this world and wander aimlessly like the other world pioneers. What a pity. Looks like it's hard to find such a world pioneer, but it's all for naught now. One world pioneer sighed. That's why I said it's a greater challenge. Luo Fan said nonchalantly. At this moment, the other world pioneers were slightly stunned, and only then did they remember what Luo Fan had said to them about where the greater challenge lay. They originally thought that entering such a perfect world and activating the world pioneers so that they could recover their strength would be a greater challenge. However, thinking about it carefully, how was the entire process even considered a challenge? When they entered that world, they merely followed beside Luo Fan and casually released their strength and power according to Luo Fan's instructions. How was there any risk at all? Not difficult at all. Who would have thought that this was the reason for the challenge? It was because the creator of the perfect world didn't approve of them. It was because the creator of the perfect world didn't trust them. If that's the case, it's indeed not a small challenge. One world pioneer sighed. If this was the case for a perfect world pioneer, then the other world pioneers would naturally have a similar mentality. If there was one, under such circumstances, it would be 10 times more difficult for them to find a perfect world opener to join them than to find an ordinary world opener. This was a real challenge. Let's go. Let's continue, Luo Fan said. Then, they found another island that was similar to this one and headed towards it. Of course, this time, they weren't like before, where they didn't care about the derivatives that were formed after the heaven and earth absorbed the essence and power of the heaven and earth in a state of chaos. This time, they were walking one derivative at a time, saving one derivative at a time. Of course, it could also be said that they were destroying one derivative at a time. The reason why they chose different places was because this place was a little far from the next island that was suspected to be a perfect world. The reason why he chose a different location was that this place was a little far away from the next island that was suspected to be a perfect world. Similarly, among the world pioneers who were rescued, nearly half of them did not agree with Luo Fan and the others. After being rescued, they left without a care in the world. Similarly, nearly half of the creators that were rescued did not agree with Luo Fan and the rest. After being rescued, they left without a care for anything else. Similarly, among the world pioneers who were rescued, nearly half of them did not agree with Luo Fan and the others. After being rescued, they left without a care in the world. After they had traveled a certain distance, and several days had passed, the island formed by the perfect world behind them suddenly began to shake violently. Just as they walked for a distance, and a few days passed, suddenly, the island formed by the perfect world behind them began to shake violently. What's going on? The world pioneers who sensed the situation were all shocked and uncertain. The world's will has made its move. Luo Fan only sighed at this time. At this moment, they were already unimaginably far away from the island. At this distance, they could only sense a trace of the island's aura from afar. They did not even have the ability to see the island clearly. Then what should we do? A world pioneer asked Luo Fan. Luo Fan frowned and said, "Let's go back and take a look." His words made the expressions of the other world founders tense up. Obviously, they were actually quite nervous about Luo Fan's decision. After all, they were currently facing the great world's will. Even if they knew that Luo Fan was protecting them, they still felt uneasy and could not face such an enemy calmly. However, facing the world's will was also what they had been looking forward to all along. Now that they had followed Luo Fan to walk around and work hard in this world, wasn't it to gather enough power to resist the world's will? Now, although the timing was not right, it was still an opportunity. An opportunity to see how powerful the enemy that they would definitely encounter was. Since they had already made their decision, then there was no need to delay. At this moment, everyone's hearts jolted and they followed Luo Fan back. Like a bolt of lightning, they swiftly traversed the endless void and soon arrived at the island. But it was a pity that even with their speed, the island had already undergone an irreversible change after they arrived. The entire island was in tatters, and the perfect world had completely collapsed. As for the creator of the perfect world, there were only traces of him left, and not even a corpse could be found. Isn't he too weak? Why can't he hold on for such a short period of time? A world pioneer said in disbelief. From a moment they discovered it to the moment they rushed over, it did not even take them a breath's time. Generally speaking, a breath's time was something that even they could withstand when facing the will of the heavens and earth. But why couldn't the creator of the perfected heavens and earth last for a breath's time? By the time they arrived, the creator had already been easily dealt with. This situation made them feel greatly disappointed in the creator of the perfect world. They only felt that their search for the creator of the perfect world was futile. If he was that weak, then any creator of the universe could easily crush him. What was the use of finding such a weakling? At that moment, disappointment and disdain surged in the hearts of many world pioneers, making it hard for them to keep calm. It's not that he's weak, it's just that this world is too complete. Luo Fan sighed at this time. He could tell with a single glance that before this world, or rather, this island collapsed, the flow of time had already been adjusted. In their opinion, they might not have rushed over for a breath's time, but in that world, hundreds of millions of years might have passed. With such a long time, unless the creator of the perfect world had the power of a true sage like Luo Fan, it would be impossible for him to hold on for so long. Even if he was not inferior to Luo Fan, it was still the same. At that moment, he only gave a general explanation to the other world pioneers. When the world pioneers heard this, they were stunned. Then, they carefully sensed the ruins of the island and found that it was as Luo Fan had guessed. The traces of changing the flow of time could not be more obvious. When they discovered this, many world pioneers frowned. This was clearly not the action of a perfect world pioneer. No matter how confident that world pioneer was, he was not a fool, after all. After sensing the strength of his opponent, it was impossible for him to completely separate himself from the outside world and cut off his path of retreat. Therefore, there could only be one existence that made this adjustment and made the flow of time in this world countless times faster than the outside world. That was their enemy, the will of this great world. Only that existence had the motive to carry out such a change. However, what did it mean for the will of the world to make such a change in the perfect world? It meant that the means and power of the will of the world was countless times more brilliant than they had imagined. This also meant that the enemy they were about to face would be countless times more brilliant than they had imagined. Under such circumstances, even the extremely optimistic pioneers of the world felt an invisible pressure on them, making it difficult for them to breathe. Why must we look for such a world pioneer? Suddenly, one of the world pioneers asked Luo Fan. That's right. Such a world pioneer is definitely more confident than us. It's obviously less likely for them to believe your words. If that's the case, perhaps if we have one more world pioneer in our team, the will of the world will have 9 or even 10 more of them. If that's the case, won't there be a greater disparity between us and the enemy? Another world pioneer asked further. Hearing this, Luo Fan only smiled. There won't be such a great disparity. It's normal for the first person to not believe it at all, but with this example, the chances of the others believing it will be higher. At this moment, he still did not say why there must be a perfect world pioneer participating. However, those words had already made those creators feel a little relieved. After all, what Luo Fan said was not a wrong judgment. With the existence of this ruin, if other perfect world pioneers were brought here, they would probably be moved. Once they were moved, they would naturally have more trust in what Luo Fan and the others said. The possibility of them seeing through their own strength would naturally be higher. Therefore, perhaps the possibility of a perfect world pioneer joining the team was not as high as an ordinary world pioneer, but it was not as slim as they thought. Since this place had completely turned into ruins, there was naturally no need for them to continue staying here. Then, they turned around and returned to their original positions, moving even faster towards the island that they had pointed out. Compared to the beginning, the speed at which they saved the world pioneers had increased by dozens of times. It was not that their methods of saving had improved, but that many of the world pioneers had already grasped the method to save the world pioneers, so there was no need for Luo Fan to save every single derivative. In other words, at this time, Luo Fan only needed to sit in a certain position and observe the situation of the derivatives. He just needed to prevent the will of the world from attacking them, while he was not by the side of the world's founders. On the other hand, the world pioneers could split up and enter many derivatives at the same time to save the world pioneers among the derivatives. With such a rescue method, the efficiency of the world pioneers in each derivative was naturally not as high as that of Luo Fan personally. There might even be many sequelae. However, as a whole, the efficiency was far from what Luo Fan could compare to alone. Precisely because of this, the efficiency of their rescue along the way had increased by dozens or even hundreds of times compared to the original. In this way, when they arrived at the second island that was suspected to be a perfect world, their team had already grown to the point where there were thousands of world pioneers. Compared to the original team of hundreds of world pioneers, this was already more than 10 times larger. Do we need to continue? A world pioneer asked Luo Fan. Obviously, he was not referring to the island in front of him that was suspected to be a perfect world, but to the other derivatives. There were many derivatives around the island as well. Chapter 2895. The Heaven and Earth Creator's question was obviously to ask Luo Fan if he needed to continue splitting up like before and let the other Heaven and Earth Creators head to the derivatives around the island to save the Heaven and Earth Creators. Luo Fan only smiled faintly at this question and said, "Let's save them first. Perhaps we'll have to leave this place later. We won't have time to save them then." Hearing this, the other Heaven and Earth Creators naturally responded and split up into teams to head to the derivatives as they had always done. Soon, they entered and came out with a new Heaven and Earth Creator. These new Heaven and Earth Creators that were saved from the derivatives by the Heaven and Earth Creators were very rare. They actually doubted the words of the Saviors. In other words, they decided to stay by Luo Fan's side and observe the situation. It seems that this is a good start. Seeing this scene, Luo Fan thought to himself, these Heaven and Earth Creators trusted him even more. This was clearly a good sign, and it made him more confident in convincing the next perfect Heaven and Earth Creators. Even though he had always appeared to be very confident, as if nothing could stump him and any difficulties did not matter to him. The truth was that he did not care about any difficulties at all. He was still a little nervous about convincing the perfect Heaven and Earth Creators. However, he did not show it. At this time, to be able to have some good omens, to him, it couldn't be better. When all the Heaven and Earth Creators gathered again, Luo Fan led them to the island below. This island looked like a small island from the outside, but once they stepped on it, they would realize that it was similar to the previous island formed by the perfect Heaven and Earth. There was also a huge difference between the inside and the outside. When they stepped on it, they would see an incomparably vast Heaven and Earth. This Heaven and Earth was a little different from the previous perfect Heaven and Earth. The structure of this Heaven and Earth was unusual. The entire Heaven and Earth seemed to exist with flowing light as its foundation. At a glance, there was flowing light everywhere. The sky, earth, mountains, rivers, oceans, continents, plants, forests, insects, fish, birds, beasts, and so on. Everything was constructed by flowing light. This kind of Heaven and Earth was quite unique to the many Heaven and Earth Creators. Of course, it was only unique, and it did not reach the level that shocked the other Heaven and Earth Creators. After all, compared to ordinary cultivators, the experience of Heaven and Earth Creators was completely different. The Heaven and Earth that they had seen was not something that ordinary cultivators could compare to. Although this kind of Heaven and Earth constructed by flowing light was unique, it was not like they had never seen something similar before. As a result, they only paid a little attention to this world at this moment, and then they didn't pay much attention to it. They directly treated this world that was overflowing with light as an ordinary world. At this moment, Luo Fan could not help but be surprised. The Heaven and Earth Creator in this Heaven and Earth is stronger than the previous perfect Heaven and Earth. The Heaven and Earth Creator in the previous perfect Heaven and Earth only managed to preserve his intelligence. His power was completely absorbed by the great Heaven and Earth and fused with the perfect Heaven and Earth. He cannot mobilize any of it at all. However, the Heaven and Earth Creator in this Heaven and Earth was different. This world was created by the Creator, but not only did he leave behind his own consciousness, he even went one step further and preserved a bit of his power. Just like at this moment, when Luo Fan and the others stepped into this Heaven and Earth, a strange sense locked onto them, making them feel like they were being spied on. "Since you've discovered us, why don't you show yourself?" Luo Fan said with a smile. The voice was clear and had endless penetrative power. In the blink of an eye, it had already swept through the heaven and earth that was filled with flowing light and entered the ears of an extremely special existence in this heaven and earth. Along with the voice, the feeling of being spied on fluctuated slightly. Then, a figure formed by flowing light appeared in front of everyone. This figure was extremely illusory. At first glance, it seemed like an absolutely illusory shadow, but upon closer inspection, one would discover that such a light contained some kind of indescribable power. It seemed to be connected with everything in this heaven and earth, as if it could mobilize all the power and all the essence of this heaven and earth. Looking at this figure, it was like looking at a miniature version of this heaven and earth. Luo Fan smiled faintly and said, "The world that fellow Taoists can control now should be insignificant. Let's help fellow Taoists." As he spoke, with a thought, a stream of consciousness poured into the flowing light and colorful figure in front of him. So impatient, the heaven and earth creators behind him were secretly shocked. At this moment, the figure did not even have the time to speak. Whether he was the heaven and earth creator or not was still a question mark. Wasn't it a little too impatient to directly help him break free from the natural shackles and the suppression of the heaven and earth's will? However, since they had already joined Luo Fan's team, they naturally had to listen to Luo Fan's instructions. Since Luo Fan had already decided to do so, they obviously could only go with the flow. Therefore, they could only follow the flow and continue to do so. Therefore, in accordance with the previous method, they used their own souls, their own strength, their own will, their own might, and their own essence to follow Luo Fan's guidance and pour into the colorful figure in front of them. In the blink of an eye, the figure suddenly swelled up like a balloon that had been blown up. At this moment, the flowing light and colorful figure seemed to have reacted and quickly struggled. As he struggled, ripples that could be seen with the naked eye spread out in all directions. They gradually agitated the surrounding void, the surrounding laws, and the surrounding time, causing the entire world to tremble. Faintly, the great Tao in the dark began to undergo some kind of indescribable subtle change. Amidst this change, the flowing light and colorful figure began to undergo an indescribable change. This change continued to strengthen, and finally, at a certain moment, Luo Fan sensed something and withdrew everything he had poured into it. As he withdrew everything he had poured into it, the many heaven and earth creators behind him also withdrew everything they had poured into it, allowing the flowing light and colorful figure to finally relax. An increasingly powerful aura began to emerge from the figure's body. From just showing signs of transcendence, in the blink of an eye, it had grown to a level that surpassed the other heaven and earth creators. In that instant, the world began to tremble slightly. It seemed as if a terrifying existence was being born in this world, and it began to attack the basic structure of this world. Faced with this situation, a faint smile appeared on Luo Fan's face as he quietly watched the changes on the existence's body. After a long while, all the changes calmed down. That figure had already calmed down, and an indescribable feeling of clarity was being emitted from his body. "Thank you, fellow Taoists." The figure bowed towards Luo Fan and the other heaven and earth creators. In that instant, the other heaven and earth creators felt an indescribable pressure from the existence before them, making it difficult for them to breathe. It was obvious that the existence before them was stronger than them in every aspect. Moreover, it was much stronger. "You're too polite, fellow Taoist," Luo Fan smiled. Then, he repeated what he had said to the other heaven and earth creators time and time again. In the end, he said, "If fellow Taoist doesn't believe me, perhaps you can follow us to see what happened to the previous heaven and earth creator." "There's no need. I believe you, fellow Taoist," the heaven and earth creator said. His words left Luo Fan slightly stunned. He only asked after a long while, "Why is that? With fellow Taoist strength, it's unlikely that you'll completely believe everything I've said." The heaven and earth creator smiled faintly. Although I was previously restricted to this island, I'm not completely clueless about the changes in the outside world. Although I didn't personally witness what happened to the other heaven and earth creator, I could sense it from afar. I naturally know if it's true or false. Hearing this, Luo Fan finally relaxed and said, "That's for the best. I hope that every fellow Taoist can be like fellow Taoist." The heaven and earth creator smiled faintly. "How is that possible? I'm only able to maintain some power because my path of cultivation is different from others. I wouldn't say it's impossible for other heaven and earth creators to achieve what I have, but it's extremely rare. The other heaven and earth creators could not imagine things would turn out like this. It took them a long while to react, and they couldn't help but be overjoyed. With the addition of another heaven and earth creator, their group strength had increased by a lot. To them, this sort of increase in strength meant that they would be even safer. One could well imagine how wonderful of a thing this was for them. At that moment, the other heaven and earth creators all came to meet the heaven and earth creator, trying to form a good relationship with him. After a long while, everyone left the island together. It was the same for the perfect heaven and earth creator who was overflowing with light. Compared to the other heaven and earth creators who were reluctant to part with the derivatives of their own world, the brilliant heaven and earth creator did not care about the derivatives of his own world at all. It was as if he completely treated this place as a cage to imprison himself. However, he left decisively, without any reluctance at all. When the creator of the world asked him about it, he simply replied indifferently, "Everything here is just a clone. Everything that was originally here had already disappeared the moment it entered this world. Therefore, they have nothing to do with me at all." Hearing this, the heaven and earth creators all looked at each other. They were both in awe and fear of the heaven and earth creator's clarity. Although this was true, and although this island looked exactly the same as the heaven and earth creator, it was fundamentally different from the original. It was a product of this great world's replication and reconstruction. However, he had still lived in this world for such a long time. Although it seemed like this island had been born for a long time in this world from the outside, it should not be forgotten that as a derivative of a perfect heaven and earth, the time inside and outside was relatively independent. Therefore, although only a short period of time had passed on the outside, tens of thousands or even hundreds of millions of years had passed on the inside of this world. After staying on this island for such a long period of time, he had always felt this island and participated in the operation of the various laws and cycles of reincarnation. No matter what, it was impossible for him to not have any emotional connection with this world, right? In other words, although the essence of this world had been changed and could be considered a clone of the original world, it did not seem much different from the original world. Moreover, the time he had spent with this clone was long enough for him to establish a connection that was not inferior to the connection he had with the original body. Under such circumstances, there was not much difference between this clone and the original body. However, despite this fact, the brilliant creator of the perfect world did not care about the connection he had established with the clone. Because it was a clone and not the original body that he had created, he casually abandoned it without any reluctance to part with it. It was unknown whether this kind of temperament was heartless or sentimental. Chapter 2896. The brilliant and colorful perfect heaven and earth creator completely abandoned the source of the perfect heaven and earth and lightly followed Luo Fan to the next perfect heaven and earth. This great heaven and earth had already devoured almost all the heaven and earth that existed in the simulated state of chaos. Among them, the number of perfect heaven and earth was unimaginably high. Although it was not as exaggerated as saying that it was endless, it still needed tens of thousands of perfect heaven and earth to describe it clearly. In this way, it was not difficult for Luo Fan to find the derivative of the perfect heaven and earth in this heaven and earth. It could be said that one could eventually find such a derivative in almost any direction. The only difference was whether they were closer or further away. Therefore, even though he had already found two perfect heaven and earth derivatives and made one perfect heaven and earth creator follow him, it was still not difficult for Luo Fan to find other perfect heaven and earth derivatives. In the next few years, Luo Fan focused his rescue efforts on the perfect heaven and earth creators. He only saved some ordinary derivative of the normal heaven and earth creators when it was along the way. Of course, for ordinary derivative of the normal heaven and earth creators, it was more than enough to save them. However, there was no need for Luo Fan to personally say anything in order to save them. Therefore, along the way, even if it was along the way, the results were already quite impressive. After a few years, the number of perfect heaven and earth creators they saved was only about 100, while the number of ordinary heaven and earth creators they saved had already exceeded 10,000. In contrast, the number of heaven and earth creators that were saved did not believe in Luo Fan at all and directly left was about the same. This was the case for perfect heaven and earth creators and ordinary heaven and earth creators. However, compared to the heaven and earth creators that followed Luo Fan, the fate of the heaven and earth creators that left was worrying. Until now, apart from a few heaven and earth creators that left recently, none of the remaining heaven and earth creators could survive. They were all captured by the heaven and earth will of this great heaven and earth. It's a pity that they don't believe you. On this day, a perfect heaven and earth creator sighed to Luo Fan. At that moment, the many founders of the world could sense that the world's will was descending in an extremely distant location that was almost beyond the range of their senses. Clearly, another creator of the world had been captured by the will of the world. In our opinion, it might be a pity, but perhaps their situation after being captured is better than ours. At this time, Luo Fan said indifferently. Hearing that, the other world founders smiled bitterly. This possibility did exist. However, it was clear that as founders of the universe, even if they were only ordinary founders of the universe, they would not entrust their lives to such guesses. Perhaps after being captured by the will of the heavens and earth, his situation would indeed become better and his life would become more comfortable. However, that was ultimately only a possibility. Furthermore, it was an extremely unlikely possibility. How could they risk their lives for such a possibility? Perhaps. However, it doesn't mean anything to us at all. The perfect heaven and earth creator sighed. Luo Fan only smiled. Just as he was about to say something, another perfect heaven and earth creator suddenly asked, "But what should we do next? Continue to strengthen our ranks like this? What's our ultimate goal? What's the point of continuing on like this?" Hearing those words, many of the world founders fell silent. It was a rather sharp question. In fact, almost every creator of the universe had thought of this question before this. After all, it was something closely related to their fates. If they could not figure this out, they would naturally be at a loss that could not be erased from the bottom of their hearts. Luo Fan's expression did not change at all. He only said, "Meaning? Of course there is. The meaning of our existence is to continue growing until we are strong enough to affect the balance of this world. At that time, this world will inevitably undergo some sort of change because of our existence. What I need is that kind of change." Many world founders looked at Luo Fan as if they were looking at a madman. Continue growing until the point where it could affect the balance of this world. Such a goal would not be considered much in an ordinary world. The existence of any world founder was enough to make an ordinary world lose its balance. But to target this world, that was simply like an ant saying that it would keep giving birth until the number of ants was enough to affect the balance of the universe and change it. In that instant, everyone had the same thought in their minds: this person is crazy. If that's your goal, perhaps we can go our separate ways, fellow Taoist, one of the perfect heaven and earth creators said without holding back. The other world founders also looked at Luo Fan with a worried expression, wanting to see how he would answer. "What? Do you think this goal is absurd?" Luo Fan only asked in return, "Of course it is. I'm sure you know how great this world is, fellow Taoist. Even if we combine our powers, we probably won't be able to resist a single incarnation of this world's will. How strong would we have to become in order to truly affect the balance of this world? Not to mention, for every additional member we have, the world will have at least one more member similar to us. This is a natural balance, and you want to break it with this method? The perfect heaven and earth creator said solemnly. This is what the worlds will want us to think. Luo Fan only sighed. He did not dare to say that he understood the worlds will better than all the world founders present. However, he had a better understanding of this world's will than any of the world founders present. As he gained more understanding, he naturally knew that the will of this great world seemed to be powerful and unstoppable, but it was not something that could be resisted. But in reality, its level was only about the same as his. Perhaps the power, and other aspects that it grasped would be much more than what he grasped. However, in terms of quality, it would definitely not be much stronger than him. Otherwise, the worlds would not be at a loss for what to do when it was released by the three-legged cauldron that he had condensed with the power related to a true sage. Since it was only at this level in terms of quality, then the worlds would definitely not be as powerful and invincible as the other world founders had imagined. Perhaps the incarnation strength was enough to crush all the world founders, and it seemed that its original body would be more powerful and terrifying, so it would be easier for it to crush them. However, that was only a seeming possibility. In reality, the difference between the incarnation of the world's will and its original body was probably just a difference in size. In essence, there should not be much difference between the two. In other words, if they had a way to deal with the incarnation of the world's will, it almost meant that they had the ability to deal with the original body of the world's will. With this confidence, Luo Fan dared to set this goal that seemed extremely absurd and had no self-awareness. What do you mean? The other world founders were secretly shocked. Luo Fan did not look like a lunatic at all. Instead, he seemed to be more clear-headed and understanding than other world founders. If that was the case, then there must be a reason for him to say this at this time. So, what evidence was there that made him so confident that this seemingly absurd and unbelievable plan could succeed? Boom! Boom! At this moment, countless thunderclaps suddenly erupted in the sky, and the rolling sound waves pressed down on the sea. The rumbling of thunder was so terrifying that the sound waves had already materialized, turning into visible ripples that filled the heavens and earth with all sorts of strange objects. Under the sound waves, the sea began to surge violently, as if thousands of soldiers and horses had charged into the sea, causing the sea to become extremely violent. This earth-shattering commotion caused many of the world's founders to freeze. Then they all fell into deep thought. It seemed that the world was a little anxious, but why? Could it be because of what Luo Fan was about to say? For a moment, an indescribable expectation rose in the hearts of the world founders, making them pay close attention to what Luo Fan would say next. What's wrong? Anxious? At this time, Luo Fan raised his head to look at the sky. Faintly, he seemed to see an incomparably huge whirlpool rotating in the sky. It seemed to contain endless power, endless majesty, and infinite wisdom. You're making both sides suffer. A faint voice faintly seeped into Luo Fan's ears amidst the thunderclaps. At this moment, none of the other world founders could hear this voice. Clearly, this voice was specifically targeted at Luo Fan, deliberately blocking the voices of the other world founders. Perhaps, but isn't it the end now? What do you think I've been doing all these years? Luo Fan said. What did you discover? That faintly discernible voice spoke again. I discovered what you've always wanted to hide. Luo Fan said. In that instant, an unimaginable suppressive force began to spread endlessly in all directions from his body. In the sky, under the sea, in all directions, everything that the naked eye could see was within the range of this suppressive force. With this change, all movements in the surroundings instantly calmed down. In a trance, it was as if everything in the universe had been frozen. The heavens and earth became silent. In an instant, the endless thunderclaps from before disappeared without a trace, as if they had never appeared in the first place. Sound was also a wave and a movement, so it could naturally be suppressed by the suppressive force. Under such circumstances, as long as Luo Fan wasn't willing, no sound could be heard. At this moment, Luo Fan asked the 100 World Founders, fellow Taoists, don't you feel that there's something strange about the perfect characteristics of your worlds? Something strange about the perfect characteristics? What's strange about it? Isn't it always like this? Our worlds have been raised to the limit, to the point where there's no more room for us to improve, so we have to achieve perfection. One of the world founders frowned. It was the same for the other complete world creators. All of them had doubtful looks on their faces. Clearly, they didn't know what Luo Fan meant by this. 7 great tribulations and achieving perfection? Luo Fan smiled faintly. What's wrong with that? The other world founders were curious. After 7 great tribulations, one would achieve perfection. This was the same for all the world founders, and it was common knowledge in the primal chaos. Why did Luo Fan say that it was a very strange thing? Could it be that you have never cultivated before? Luo Fan simply asked. The other world founders frowned. He was simply toying with them. Could it be that they had made some low-level mistakes? Fellow Taoist, there's no need to keep us in suspense. Just say it, one world founder said. If you've cultivated before, you should know that there's no limit to cultivation. Every realm has a higher realm. Since that's the case with cultivation, how can a world that can continuously improve be an exception? Luo Fan asked in return. His words instantly caused the expressions of all the cultivators to change drastically. They didn't think about it before it was mentioned, but now that Luo Fan pointed at them, they realized an extremely strange fact. Normally, the improvement of a world should be endless, but now they had achieved perfection in this state of primal chaos. Chapter 2897. Chaos, Incomplete. One of the world founders muttered with an indescribable expression on his face. As the creators of the world, they were not fools. Since they were not fools, they still knew basic logical reasoning. In this way, faced with so much evidence, they could naturally think of what was the most likely reason for all the evidence to appear. The moment he said that, the bodies of all the founders of the world shuddered. They had indeed thought of this possibility, but it was ultimately just their own thoughts. Even they did not dare to believe that this would really happen. But now, hearing the same deduction from the mouth of another creator of the world, that feeling of disbelief quickly faded away. Chaos is incomplete. How is that possible? The same thought flashed through the minds of the world founders. The possibility of an incomplete primal chaos state was too shocking. After all, that was the state of chaos, which was billions of times more vast than them. Just a little bit of its power was enough to get rid of them completely. Such an existence was actually incomplete. It was like an ant suddenly discovering that the universe it was in might have some flaws. The world founders were not ordinary, after all, so the disbelief did not linger in their hearts for too long. Very quickly, they restrained their emotions and put on solemn expressions. No matter how ridiculous it seemed that this was the only explanation that made sense. So, in this incomplete chaos, this world seems to be infinitely great, but in essence, it is also limited by the chaos. In fact, its level is not much higher than that of Consummate World. A Consummate World's creator said with a thoughtful look on his face. Yes, that's right. Luo Fan just smiled and said. His words made the world founders fall into silence. If that was really the case, then it might not be as difficult to deal with this world as they had imagined. As for the world's will, it did not seem to be as terrifying as they had imagined. Of course, if they were to take it a step further, the world founder that seemed to far surpass all the other world founders did not seem to be much stronger than them. At this moment, all the world founders could not help but have their thoughts waver. At this moment, Luo Fan instantly sensed the emotional changes of many world founders. His expression did not change at all, but he only sneered inwardly. These world founders were the founders of other worlds after all. They were not living beings born from his world, so it was impossible for them to wholeheartedly rely on him. In this case, it might be difficult for us to affect the balance of the world, but it doesn't seem impossible. A perfect world founder said at this moment, directly suppressing the thoughts of all the other world founders. Although Luo fans' strength might not be as powerful and terrifying as they had originally thought. But one thing was certain, and that was that the strength he displayed was greater than theirs. Perhaps this might not be his true strength, but he had borrowed some external force or item. But no matter what, since this external force or item could be controlled by him, then it was his strength. Under such circumstances, if they were to fall out with him, they would obviously be the ones to suffer. With this understanding, how could they dare to fall out with him? Furthermore, things had not developed to that stage. The conflict between them and Luo Fan was ultimately just a minor one, and not something that could not be reconciled. With these various thoughts, it was only natural that the world founders would behave like this. That's right, we only need to construct some sort of sublimation product to break the balance of the world. Another world founder said, as if nothing had happened. For the many world founders, their knowledge and strength allowed them to grasp countless methods. It was not difficult for them to sublimate some of the weaker powers. Even if the weaker power referred to their own strength, it was still the same. At this moment, the eyes of the many world founders lit up. Still, the ability to sublimate inferior powers was not a special technique mastered by a single creator of the universe. Instead, it was a method that almost all world founders could grasp. At this moment, the many world founders felt that their future seemed to have become extremely bright. At this moment, the sky in the distance suddenly turned dark. This darkness was like a ring, completely enveloping the area they were in. It was as if this area had been directly swallowed by some extremely terrifying monster. The world seems to be completely enraged, one of the world founders mumbled. Although all of this happened in the ring that surrounded them in the distance, all of them clearly knew that everything had changed because of them. It was because of their discussion, because they had revealed the essence of chaos and the essence of the world, that the world was enraged and attacked them. As for why this method of attacking them would eventually turn into a ring that surrounded them in all directions, like a terrifying monster that was about to devour something, it surrounded them in the center. It was naturally because of Luo Fan's unbelievable defensive method. As expected, this fellow Taoist can indeed resist the world's will. At this moment, the same thought flashed through the minds of many world founders. These were the world founders who had not truly witnessed how Luo Fan resisted the world's will. In other words, almost all the world founders. After all, apart from the first world founder who built the underwater city, no other world founders had truly witnessed how Luo Fan resisted the world's will. The other world founders had always been by Luo Fan's side only because they had seen how tragic the outcomes of the other world founders who did not follow him were. As for whether Luo Fan could really resist the world's will, they were still half convinced and half doubtful. In that instant, the surroundings fell silent. The world founders felt an inexplicable sense of reverence towards Luo Fan. Even though they had already understood the nature of this world and the nature of the world's will, they were still extremely clear that with their current strength, they were still extremely weak compared to the world's will. Under such circumstances, let alone resisting the world, even if they were to break away from Luo Fan's protection, they would probably be immediately dealt with by the world's will. But now, Luo Fan had displayed such unbelievably powerful strength. He could actually directly repel the enraged world's will, preventing it from touching them at all. How could they not be shocked by such an ability and strength? In that instant, many world founders began to rejoice at the choice they had made. If they had not been by Luo Fan's side, they would have probably been attacked like this a long time ago. Let's begin, Luo Fan said faintly to the few exceptional heaven and earth pioneers. The world founders were stunned at first, before they came to a sudden realization. They understood what Luo Fan meant, and all of them became a little excited. What Luo Fan was talking about was naturally the plan that they had originally planned to carry out in the future to sublimate their strength and might. At the moment, there were over 100 perfect world openers here, and there were over 10,000 ordinary world openers. Compared to the countless world openers in this world, it was still insignificant, but in terms of absolute numbers, it was already a considerable number. With such a sizable amount, it was naturally unthinkable for them to directly sublimate to the point of being able to break through this part of the world and surpass this part of the world. However, if they could sublimate their strength to the point that they could resist the suppression of the world's will, it did not seem to be that difficult. At this time, many of the world's founders woke up one after another and understood what Luo Fan was talking about. Therefore, they began to take action at this moment. Many world founders began to exchange a huge amount of information with each other. In just a few breaths of time, they had already unified their thoughts and decided on a method of sublimation. Although it seemed to only be a few breaths of time, they had already formed a tacit understanding. However, in reality, if they were to truly discuss and debate, there would probably be billions of words to say. If it wasn't them, but ordinary living beings, it would probably take decades to complete billions of words. However, there was naturally nothing much to say at this moment. After they finished their discussion, they began to take action one by one, moving according to the method that they had discussed before. Not long after, they had already formed a huge formation in the void. It was a three-dimensional and extremely mysterious formation that spread in all directions and even went deep into the depths of space-time. This formation used many perfected world creators as the core nodes, and many other ordinary world creators as the materials. As soon as it was formed, it naturally emitted an inconceivable aura. It began to faintly shake the suppressive power that Luo Fan had guided over from his other clone. Although it was not enough to break through the suppression of the suppression power, it was enough to slightly stir it, forcing it to release more power to maintain this subtle suppression method, or rather, a defensive method. "Looks like you don't need me anymore," Luo Fan said with a faint smile on his face. Before the world founders could react, he instantly retracted the terrifying suppression power that he had released. As the suppression power was retracted, the world instantly turned dark. Endless dark clouds rushed towards the center from all directions like an earth-shattering wave. In the blink of an eye, it had already covered the clear sky. At the same time, the seawater below them began to churn violently. A boundless, terrifying power seemed to have appeared out of thin air and began to gather beneath their feet. An unimaginable sense of crisis swept through the hearts of the world founders, making them feel as if they had turned into small animals that were trembling in front of their natural enemy. This is the wrath of the world's will. At this moment, the world founders who originally had other thoughts no longer dared to think about it. They were only shocked by the endless, terrifying power that was coming from all directions, as well as the unimaginable suppression. At this moment, they truly felt the pressure that Luo Fan had endured. They truly understood what kind of price they had to pay to deal with the world's will. At this moment, they had completely lost everything they could rely on. They could only rely on each other, unleash their own power with all their might, and defend the formation they had just constructed with all their might. Only then could they barely prevent their minds from collapsing under the wrath of the world's will. "Hurry up, hurry up!" Many world founders furiously roared. As they roared, the power in their bodies, their beliefs, their worldview, their divine abilities, their might, and their intrinsic qualities were all stimulated. Through the formations they had created, they began to circulate madly inside and outside the bodies of the founders of heaven and earth. A faint light began to emerge from their bodies and began to expand. In the end, a space the size of a battle array was gradually formed around their bodies. It was difficult for them to protect the little bit of living space that they had. The light was faintly discernible, but it pierced through the surrounding darkness, giving them an indescribable hope. Chapter 2898. However, this thought was quickly extinguished in the hearts of many of the world's founders. It wasn't that they felt that this thought was wrong, but that the world's will wasn't as powerful as they had imagined. Instead, it was because they no longer had any spare energy to produce even the slightest trace of distracting thoughts. At this moment, they only felt as if the entire world was pressing down on them. Even with the support of many other founders, they felt as if everything about them was about to collapse in the next moment. At this moment, They could only gather all their thoughts, strength, power, essence, and everything else that belonged to them. They circulated along the formation and constantly gathered towards the center, gradually producing all sorts of subtle sublimations. The light emitted from the formation grew brighter and brighter, more and more condensed, more and more substantial, and more dazzling. An indescribable feeling of transcendence gradually emerged from the light. Many of the founders, who were the nodes of the formation, gradually felt a subtle sense of relief rising from the bottom of their hearts. It was as if the terrifying power that was pressing down on them from all directions and wanted to crush them had suddenly weakened. Noticing this, the eyes of the hundreds of perfect world founders lit up. This meant that their formation was starting to take effect. The pressure from the worlds was finally starting to be slightly broken by them. Looks like the possibility of success isn't small. At this moment, Luo Fan, who was watching from the side, revealed a faint smile. He was rather satisfied in his heart. This scene before him meant that the formation was rather effective. The world founders could indeed rely on the sublimated power to resist the world's will. Although the confrontation wasn't too strong and the gap between the two sides was still huge, it was only because there weren't enough world founders. If there were more world founders, 100, 1,000, or even 10,000 times more, then the sublimated power condensed by the formation would be 100, 1,000, or even 10,000 times stronger than it was now. At that time, the gap between the two sides would no longer be as huge as it was now. The world founders didn't know what Luo Fan was thinking. At this moment, they didn't have the energy to pay attention to anything outside the formation. At this moment, a boundless and terrifying power was being generated from all directions. It was like a monstrous wave that covered the sky and covered the earth as it surged towards them. It carried with it an aura that could destroy the heavens and the earth, as well as the determination to destroy the universe. At this moment, this region seemed to have been completely separated from this world. The endless attacks made people wonder if all the disasters and calamities that existed in this part of the world had all gathered here. The countless attacks crushed towards the formation formed by the world founders, causing the formation to violently shake. Many of the founders could sense the never-ending impact. In their senses, they felt like they had turned into ants that had fallen into a surging ocean. Under this change, the formation frantically extracted everything it could from the world founders, doing its best to circulate the formation and condense it at the center. It was doing everything it could to further sublimate and strengthen the sublimated power at the center. Fortunately, this was a world creator, not an ordinary cultivator. For such existences, their existence was like a perpetual motion machine. No matter what damage they suffered, as long as their fundamental existence was not shaken, they could recover in an instant. This was the only characteristic that allowed them to remain unscathed under the crazy extraction of energy from the formation. If it wasn't for this, they would have long been sucked into nothingness. However, even so, they were still in extreme pain at this moment. The feeling of having everything extracted from one's body and having to constantly operate everything in order to maintain the integrity of one's body was really not a wonderful feeling. At this moment, Luo Fan was quietly watching everything unfold from the side. His entire body seemed to be enveloped by the boundless tribulations and attacks unleashed by the will of the heavens and earth. But no matter how the attacks enveloped him, he didn't suffer the slightest impact, nor was he injured at all. The reason for this was naturally because of the essence of his clone. This clone did not rely on the power that was related to the true saint, but a secondary power that was derived from the collision of that power. However, just this secondary power was already much stronger than the will of the heavens and earth. It could be said that if it wasn't for the fact that this power was too little, and if he wanted to rely on this power to resist the world's will, he would have to increase this power by trillions of times in order to have a 20% chance of success. Luo Fan did not even need to care about the other pioneers of the world, nor did he need to search for the changes in this world after devouring many worlds, nor did he need to carry out any other plans. Just this power alone was enough to break this world and transcend. After all, he had already spent so much effort to create this little bit of power that he had entrusted to his clone. If he wanted to gather power that was trillions of times more than this, wouldn't he need to spend at least trillions of times more effort? This was clearly what Luo Fan was unwilling to do. That was why he did not choose this method and chose this method instead. Of course, in reality, this could also be regarded as a way out. Although he couldn't provide it all at once, it didn't seem to be a problem if it was divided into billions of trillions of times. Of course, if he chose this method, the time it would take might not even be able to be calculated in trillions of years. Therefore, this could only be the last and last choice. There was really no other way. In other words, it was the last way out. In fact, it was precisely because of this escape route that Luo Fan had been quite calm all along. Even though the current situation seemed to be extremely bad for him, he did not panic. At this moment, the terrifying attacks gathered in this region grew more and more. It was so much so that it was vaguely about to undergo a qualitative change, creating all sorts of strange worlds and innumerable unfathomable life forms. At this point, this region was no longer as dark as before. On the contrary, it had become colorful, as if there were countless worlds, space-times, and beings living here, carrying out all sorts of strange activities. All sorts of complicated changes were constantly affecting and pushing, turning into all sorts of impacts on the formation. It made the formation bear greater and greater pressure. The power that the founders of heaven and earth condensed and sublimated from the formation had already turned into a huge sphere that constantly pulsed in the center of the formation like a huge heart. It was the existence of the light that had opened up a strange space-time and gradually fused with the formation, causing the pressure on the founders to decrease. At this moment, the hearts of all the founders were filled with excitement. Even the ordinary world creators in the periphery could clearly see hope. The hope to resist the will of the world. They're finally going to make a move? At this moment, Luo Fan raised his brows and looked up. At this moment, a vortex appeared in the sky. It was a vortex that looked like a huge eye. As soon as the vortex appeared, the strange space-time that had been piled up by the endless attacks suddenly froze, as if everything within had instantly broken away from its original trajectory and was completely controlled by another existence. At this moment, the ball of light that had condensed in the center of the formation began to tremble irregularly. There was even a faint crackling sound coming from within the ball of light. At the same time, the space-time that it had held up also began to shake violently. Countless cracks appeared out of nowhere, making the space-time look like a mirror that had been glued together by countless fragments. How did it suddenly become so much stronger? The expressions of the many perfect world founders in the center changed drastically. As the core nodes of the formation, they were more sensitive to all changes in the formation than the other founders. At this moment, they clearly knew that this change was due to the sudden increase in the attacks from the outside world. Very soon, the founders noticed the vortex that looked like an eye in the sky. You want to resist me? You'll never be able to do that. An extremely mysterious voice came from the vortex. The voice was so mysterious that all the world founders felt their hearts being invaded by an indescribable aura. It was as if all the activities of their souls were involuntarily drawn towards the voice. At this moment, all the world founders felt their hair stand on end. This situation was clearly a sign that their souls were about to break away from their own control and be controlled by the voice. To all creators of heaven and earth, and even to all cultivators, one's own spirit was an incomparably independent existence. Even if their bodies were to be destroyed, they would not want anything to happen to their souls. But now, the worlds had only said one sentence, and they already felt that their souls were about to break away from their own control. How could they not feel their hair stand on end? Never. Luo Fan interrupted at this moment. As he said this, a suppressive force instantly spread out and covered everything in the surroundings. The world formed by the endless attacks, all living beings, and everything else was instantly suppressed by the suppressive force. Many of the pioneers of the world felt as if their minds had become clear in that instant. All the pressure and fear from the attacks and the appearance of the worlds will vanish in an instant, as if they were never there in the first place. The vortex formed by the worlds will seem to have turned into an extremely ordinary landscape. Although it was still slowly spinning in the sky, it no longer gave off an unstoppable feeling. So you still made a move. At this moment, a voice resounded from the vortex. Since you knew that I would make a move, why did you still make a move? Luo Fan smiled faintly. You will regret it. The worlds will sigh and gradually dispersed. Clearly, it did not explain to Luo Fan why it still made a move despite knowing that Luo Fan would make a move. With this experiment, I think everyone already knows what to do next. Luo Fan watched the vortex disappear, then turned his head and smiled at the world's founders. Hearing that, the founders' expressions became complicated. At this moment, they clearly understood the situation they were in. It was clear that they were not completely powerless against the will of the heavens and earth. However, before they gathered a certain number, they could only rely on Luo Fan and rely on Luo Fan to protect them. This feeling would make any creator of the universe feel extremely displeased. As the creators of the world, they were existences that could create the world in the simulated state of chaos. Protected? They had abandoned this identity countless billions of years ago. Now that they were so powerful, they actually had to pick up the identity of being protected again. It would be weird if they could feel good about it. However, it was obvious that even if they were unwilling, the truth was right in front of them. At this moment, they could only accept it obediently. We'll leave our safety to you. After a while, the world founders bowed towards Luo Fan. Luo Fan nodded with a faint smile. Chapter 2899. In the blink of an eye, 100 years had passed. After 100 years of hard work, the team around Luo Fan had grown 100 times stronger. There were already more than 10,000 perfect world founders, and there were more than 1 million ordinary world founders. On this day, 100 years after the world founders had truly tested their advantages and disadvantages against the world's will, Luo Fan had already brought the world founders back to where he started. In other words, where the world was located. Is this the world that you originated from? A perfect world founder asked Luo Fan as he pointed at the vast island in front of him. Compared to the island that they originated from, this island had an indescribable similarity. It was a characteristic of perfection. There was an inexplicable sense of familiarity within this characteristic. It was a feeling that belonged to the world founder, Luo Fan. Evidently, this should also be formed from a perfect world, and it should be a world that had an extremely close connection with Luo Fan. It was precisely because of this that he made such a judgment. There were others who had come to the same conclusion as him. The other tens of thousands of perfect world creators discovered this one after another, and had similar speculations. Compared to them, the performance of the millions of ordinary world founders was much worse. However, they were still confused. They had no idea why those perfect world founders would make the judgment that this island was the world that Luo Fan originated from. The reason for this was actually very simple. Only a perfect world founder would be sensitive enough to the characteristic of perfection. Thus, when they saw this world, they would discover that it contained the characteristic of perfection. On the other hand, because the world that ordinary world founders came from was not considered perfect, they did not understand the characteristic of perfection. They were not sensitive to it either. Before there was any concrete evidence to prove that it was a perfect world, it was difficult for them to truly confirm that it was a perfect world. Determining the nature of a world just by looking at it from afar was clearly beyond the scope of their strength. A part of it was opened by me, Luo Fan said indifferently. A part. The creators fell into deep thought and vaguely understood that perhaps this world before them was quite different from the worlds they had created themselves. Boom, boom, boom. Suddenly, thunder rumbled in the sky. The rumble that had descended after 100 years caused some of the world founders to become solemn. This situation seemed to indicate that the will of the heavens and earth had sent something. In other words, what Luo Fan was about to do might shake some plan of the will of heaven and earth. Understanding this, even if they didn't know what Luo Fan wanted to do, they became serious. Compared to the 1% of the world founders who had experienced the test 100 years ago, the remaining 99% of the world founders had not experienced the face-to-face confrontation with the worlds 100 years ago. Therefore, they were secretly shocked at this moment. They didn't know why such a thunderous rumble had suddenly appeared out of nowhere. A warning from the heavens? Some of the world's founders murmured. It's the will of the heavens and earth. One of the world founders who had faced the will of the heavens and earth 100 years ago sighed. Hearing this, the expressions of the world founders who had come later became even more solemn. The will of the heavens and earth was their enemy. They had already known this when they joined the team. However, they had only felt the aftermath of the various movements of the will of the heavens and earth. They had never truly faced the will of the heavens and earth. And now, it seemed that they were about to truly face the will of the heavens and earth at this moment. A ray of light erupted from the island in front of them. It turned into a pillar of light and soared into the sky. When it reached extremely high up in the sky, it suddenly expanded. In the blink of an eye, it had already filled the entire sky. As the brilliance covered the sky, the entire sky looked like it had turned into a painting, and all the movement that had originally existed had stopped. After this change, the faint thunderous rumbles naturally disappeared without a trace. Suppression. Those world founders who had seen Luo Fan's methods secretly thought of this word. Even if they had seen this power of suppression before, they were still incomparably shocked. This power that could even suppress the will of the heavens and earth had surpassed their understanding of the power of suppression, subverting their concept of it. Fellow Taoists, let's begin. At this moment, Luo Fan spoke to the world founders. When the world founders heard this, their expressions slightly froze. What Luo Fan wanted them to do, this point had already been made clear from the beginning. Looking at it now, it seemed like it was already time to take action. As for the specifics, the world founders had actually already discussed it from the beginning. At this moment, there was naturally no need to waste any time discussing how to set up the formation. With a single thought, the world founders turned into rays of light that soared into the sky and shot out in all directions. It looked like a light bulb suddenly emitting countless rays of light. Then, after shooting out for a certain distance, all the light beams turned around one after another and crashed into a certain spot. In the blink of an eye, they condensed in the void and formed their figures. As all the rays of light disappeared, the millions of world founders had already constructed a huge formation. A three-dimensional, mysterious, and wondrous formation that completely enveloped the island formed by Luo Fan's world. After the formation was formed, the sky in the distance turned dark. There seemed to be all sorts of subtle tremors in the depths of the sea, and the entire world seemed to be shaking violently. However, none of this was able to affect the area they were in, nor was it able to shake the formation they had constructed. In the area where the formation was located, everything had been completely suppressed by an indescribable suppression power. Under this suppression, even the will of the heavens and earth could not invade this area with its own power. Not to mention the various changes that occurred due to the will of the heavens and earth in the distance. All sorts of changes, all sorts of movements, could only take effect outside of the suppressive force. It was impossible for them to truly shake anything within this area at this time and place. Faced with this situation, Luo Fan only smiled faintly. He did not move at all, but an indescribable brilliance was emitted from his body. I can finally begin. Let me see what other tricks you have up your sleeves. As he thought this, the light gradually merged with the surrounding formation. As the light merged with the surroundings, the formation was like a car with a key inserted into it, and it instantly started to operate. Endless power, endless might, and endless mysterious essence began to surge between the world founders. As the endless power surged, The entire formation began to release an indescribably terrifying aura, and it began to separate the area it was in from the outside world. At this moment, the space-time around the formation was already covered in a layer of gray. It was faintly discernible, as if nothing existed, but it also seemed to contain everything in the universe. After this layer of mysterious existence appeared, the power of the will of the heavens and earth, or rather, the power of the great world, instantly disappeared without a trace, and it could no longer invade. Other dimensions, other parallel existences, and even other planes that couldn't be sensed in the great world started to appear like mushrooms after the rain in the area enveloped by the formation. This situation made Luo Fan instantly understand that this area was gradually being separated from the great world. The size of the great world itself was secondary. Even if its size had reached an unimaginable limit, even if billions of worlds were devoured, it would only seem to have increased by an insignificant amount, and it would still be the same. What truly made this world incomparably difficult to deal with was that this world was incomparably pure. Ordinary worlds had many parallel existences, dimensions, and dimensions. The main body of the world was already the entire world for ordinary people, but for true powerhouses, the main body of the world was only an insignificant small part of this world. Hidden behind the main body of the world were many mysterious existences that were tens of thousands of times larger than the main body of the world. However, this was not the case for this world. For this world, the main body of the world was already the entire world. The other dimensions, parallel existences, dimensions, and even the infinite planes that ordinary worlds had did not exist for this world. Among them, the other planes were slightly better. It was just that the situation of all the planes was the same as the main body of the world. It was not absolutely non-existent. However, the other dimensions, parallel existences, dimensions, and everything else really did not exist. Of course, the situation of the other planes was the same as the main body of the world. In that case, it was equivalent to the other planes not existing. Without his own characteristics, the many planes that had lost the mysteries of each plane were clearly meaningless to Luo Fan. At this moment, as the formation took shape and this area was separated from the great world, the situation in this area had clearly been separated from the great world. In this place, the various things that ordinary worlds could have were gradually being born. In parallel, the various dimensions, and even the various characteristics of the other planes began to gradually recover. It's finally broken. At this moment, an inexplicable smile appeared on Luo Fan's face. To him, losing the other layers was equivalent to his own immortality being greatly weakened. After all, if there were other planes, even if everything that he had in the real world was completely erased, he could easily recover with the existence that corresponded to him in the other planes. Not only would the entire process not consume any time, but it also wouldn't consume any energy. Now that the other aspects of his special traits had been restored, it was equivalent to his immortality finally being restored. That kind of feeling was naturally quite wonderful. Of course, this was clearly only the first step. Although this region had already been separated from the great world, it was clearly only a slight separation. It was still within the great world, still bearing the suppression of the great world, and still being eyed covetously by it. If he couldn't repel that world and couldn't withstand the methods of that world, then everything he had now would soon disappear again. At that moment, many of the founders felt their bodies lighten, as if they had been freed from some indescribable shackles. This feeling was naturally brought about by the various other dimensions, parallel locations that did not exist in that world, as well as the many planes that had almost disappeared, recovering. Although ordinary world pioneers could not be like Luo Fan, who could use this kind of immortality to improve their own survival ability and greatly enhance it. However, this undying foundation was still useful to them. It was just like an iceberg. Even though the iceberg could only discover the part of itself that was above the water's surface, when it wanted to move or even collide with other existences, the part of its body that was below the water's surface would still play a role. It was the same at this moment. Even if they couldn't make use of those to strengthen their undying nature, the foundation to strengthen their undying nature still existed. With such a strong foundation of immortality, their hearts naturally sensed it. Under this feeling, they naturally felt as if some kind of shackles had been removed from their bodies.